He told them he wasn't going to be here.
Oh, okay.
But then he ordered the lunch.
Hopefully somebody's eaten. I'm just hoping somebody.
And then he ordered the lunch.
Okay, good afternoon. I would like to call to order the regular board meeting of the North County Transit District for February 20th, 2020. And I will ask Imelda, who is serving as the board clerk today, to call roll.
Thank you, sir. Jack Feller,
Can I borrow your mic? Here.
Tony Kranz,
Here.
John Franklin, Paul McNamara, Jim Desmond, Terry Gasterland. Oh, excuse me, Dave Drucker. Excuse me.
Terry's here also.
Joel Edson, Sharon Jenkins, and Priya Bhat Patel.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. And if you'd all rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, thank you. And Imelda will now provide a safety brief and review evacuation procedures.
Thank you, sir. In case of an emergency, I will dial 911. In case of an evacuation, please take the stairs. Do not use the elevators. Once cleared of the building, do not re-enter unless cleared to do so by emergency personnel. There are fire extinguishers and first aid kits on each floor of the building. There is a portable defibrillator on the first floor and staff on hand trained on CPR procedures if needed. This concludes my safety brief, sir.
Thank you. And Imelda, are there any changes to the agenda?
No, sir, no changes to the agenda, sir.
And I don't have any public speaker slips today. So with that, we will move on. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes for the regular board meeting of January 16, 2020? Motion by board member Edson and a second by board member Bhat Patel.
On the motion of board member Edson, seconded by board member Bhat Patel, to approve the minutes of the regular board meeting held on January 16, 2020, motion passes with all board members present voting yes.
Okay, thank you. Now, moving on to the consent calendar, there are 9 items for action today. If there are no requests to have anything pulled, I would entertain a motion for approval. All right, on a motion by board member Desmond and a second by vice chair Feller, we will now vote.
On the motion of board member Desmond, seconded by vice chair Feller, to approve consent items 1 through 9, the motion passes with all board members present voting yes.
Great, thank you. Moving on to other business item, number 10. And for that item, which is the legislative agenda for 2020, Mr. Tucker will review the item.
Katie Persons, strategic planner, will make the presentation.
Good afternoon, board members. Today I'll be presenting on the 2020 legislative agenda as well as the discretionary grant strategy. So the 2020 legislative agenda is largely in the same form as last year. One important date to note is that tomorrow, February 21st, is the last day for new legislation to be introduced in California. So we intend to have a more detailed discussion regarding relevant bills at our March board meeting. So in this presentation, I'll focus primarily on the first and last rows of the table. One key addition we've made to this year's legislative agenda is the last row of this table, which is to support the maintenance of language provided in NCTD's current enabling legislation related to transit agency consolidation. So after we go through a few slides on that, at the end of the presentation, I'll discuss the discretionary grant strategy for 2020. These next two slides provide some background on the enabling legislation referenced in the legislative agenda. Public Utilities Code Section 125002, which was originally adopted by statute in 1975, states that the legislature recognizes that in order to achieve a coordinated, unified public transportation system within the San Diego region, it may be necessary to form a region-wide transit district at some future time. The legislature reserved the right to join and merge with such a region-wide district at such time as deemed mutually beneficial by the NCTD board and the region as a whole. In 2002, the legislature passed SB 1703, which created a consolidated transportation agency in San Diego from the specified existing agencies, including SANDAG, MTS, and NCTD. So with that, SB 1703 initiated a transfer of certain planning and project construction authority from the operators NCTD MTS to SANDAG while reserving transit operations for NCTD and MTS. So with that transfer, initially all projects were done by an amendment to the master MOU. And now SANDAG and NCT may enter into agreements for the transfer of certain mutually agreed upon functions, which is now done through a standard form. So digging a little deeper into some of the key functions and policies of each of the agency types as designated by that master MOU, SANDAG, as the Metropolitan Planning Organization, develops the Regional Transportation Plan, which spans several decades, the Short Range Transit Plan, which spans 5 years, and manages policies such as the public input process and the regional fare policy. SANDAG also provides technical assistance to the operators, as well as defines regional and corridor transit services and parameters for local transit services. Additionally, the operators MTS and NCTD must develop service implementation plans, which the SANDAG Board of Directors ultimately adopts. Within those service implementation plans, NCTD and MTS are responsible for planning and implementing regional and local transit services, including the development of schedules, operating, and capital budgets. The operators also provide input to SANDAG on their long and short range transit plans. So when looking at the transit services as a whole in the region, there are a few key connection points between NCTD and MTS services. On the coast, we have NCTD Route 101 and the Coaster, which travels into MTS's service territory. And you can see Route 101 and Coaster in teal and MTS's bus routes in red. And further inland, we have MTS's routes 235 and 280, which travel between Escondido and downtown San Diego. Additionally, MTS's Flex services connects with MTS's rural services in Ramona. So NCTD is currently in the process of developing its 10-year strategic plan. And in the fall of 2019, the consultant team conducted an intercept survey throughout NCTD's service area to better understand the travel and transfer patterns of its existing customers. The top 3 locations where surveyed NCTD customers transferred were Vista, Escondido, and Oceanside Transit Centers. Additionally, nearly 80% of all surveyed transfers occurred between NCTD services. That would be Breeze to Breeze or Breeze to Sprinter, for example. while 18% occurred between NCTD and other agencies, which includes MTS as well as RTA, Metrolink, and Amtrak. Of that total, 11.4% were coaster interagency transfers. So this slide provides an indicator of some of the transfer patterns across our network. And as we continue to develop our strategic plan, this information will be supplemented through our use of cell phone data. So now we'll take a look at the shared technologies between MTS and NCTD. We have our regional fare collection system. You might recall at the January board meeting, MTS staff provided an update on the regional fare collection system branding. So the next generation fare collection system will replace the existing system with in-it hardware and software by the end of this calendar year. And the existing system has servers located at MTS facilities with smart card systems installed on all regional buses and TVMs at all rail stations. So a few other shared technologies. We have our regional transit management system, which includes computer-aided dispatch and automatic vehicle location and radio system, which has servers at MTS. And we also have dispatch consoles located at NCTD's West and East divisions. Additionally, NCTD utilizes HASTIS scheduling software to schedule its Breeze and Flex routes. And that software is installed on the MTS server and is shared regionally amongst the operators and their contractors. A few other shared regional services. We have the Sorrento Valley Coaster Connection, which is a service operated within MTS's service area that also benefits coaster customers. We also have a unified fare structure that was simplified this past year and enables customers to purchase a pass from either operator, and it works across multiple modes. And we also have bus bridge services. So under the existing MOU between MTS and NCTD, MTS provides bus bridge services for coaster service disruptions south of Solana Beach to ensure a timely response to service disruptions on the corridor. And with that, any future decision to consolidate the transit agencies in the region should be predicated on the NCTD board's determination that such consolidation provides benefits to the region, creates efficiencies, protects the service needs of North County residents, and other public policy considerations of importance to the board. At this time, none of the board of directors of Sandag, MTS, or NCTD have publicly discussed or proposed consolidation of the transit agencies. Accordingly, NCTD staff proposes that the board express its support for maintenance of language provided in NCTD's current enabling legislation. So for now, I will pause for questions on the legislative agenda before we get into the discretionary grant strategy.
Okay, board member comments or questions? Board member Desmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So there's no real change on the agency consolidation legislation that you're proposing. It's just reiterating it and we're re-supporting it. Okay. And is that going to be then acknowledged or stated to the Sandag executive director in a certain way, or how's that going to be? Because it came out public in a different way. And so I'm just wondering what your recommendation might be for this board to express that.
Well, I did meet with the Sandag executive director and we did discuss this topic. His public opinion reflects purely his public opinion on this matter. I think we did have a level of discussion and expectation that he would not continue bringing this up as a topic. He did reiterate, though, that was his opinion, and if someone were to ask him, he would state that as his opinion. Just in terms of the full transparency of the discussion, when we discussed it, he talked about the context of the future plans to operate whatever number of underground miles of rail in the future. And my perspective is, you know what, then transit agency consolidation is kind of the last item to worry about if we're talking about raising in excess of $20 billion to build underground rail lines throughout the county.
Okay, but just, I guess, on the consolidation issues, is there any recommendation on making this public, or I guess it already is public?
It is
We're-
public.
We're just reinforcing what we already had.
Yeah, and if you desire, I have no problem reducing it to writing directly to him. But we did already have the communication, and I think to some degree, as we stated in there, there's been no public policy discussions by the people who actually make such decisions.
Well,
And
that would be the board.
exactly.
Oh, okay.
So from my general point of view, we should not be overreactive to the opinion of one individual, whether it be the executive director of Sandag or any public employee who's not a policymaker.
Well, I don't know, it's up to the board, I guess, this board, if we want to proceed.
Yeah.
But I'd be in favor of sending a letter or something to the effect of, we're still in support of the existing legislation.
I'll go along with that.
Yeah, and I think that one of the benefits, if you want to call it that, of the conversation is that it allowed us to kind of dust off the legislation that enabled us, and that we were able to kind of look and point out, that it is essentially at the prerogative of this board to initiate it. That said, I think also are all aware that there is a legislature that gets fairly active in transit matters down here in San Diego. So we should be keep that in mind and
Want to be cognizant of
Cognizant.
of poking the dog or a sleeping
That.
bear.
that's correct. And
All right.
and I think that, from what I've heard, MTS has no interest in this. So that I think is probably the most significant factor, is that this isn't anything that either transit agency is looking to have done. So, but I tend to agree that maybe we should convey the message in writing. And so perhaps, I don't know if it needs a
Oh, do you
motion
need
or
a
just
vote on
staff
that, or-
direction. Yeah. well,
Just nodding of heads.
Well, so I think that the motion originally was to adopt the legislative agenda as proposed, which included maintenance of the existing legislation that enables NCTD to exist. It sounds like there's a substitute motion that would, in addition to adopting the legislative agenda as stated and recommended by staff, that the board also consider whether or not you are agreeable to the board drafting and sending a letter to Sandag, I believe, in support of maintaining the legislation as it exists today.
Right.
And that, I believe, is the substitute motion.
I'll take that, yeah.
Board Member Duker.
Yeah, so is there a possibility of any type of legislation? Is there any legislation currently out there that talks about this in front of the legislature? And is there any possibility that some legislator could gut and replace something
Sure.
that would have that? Would they have the ability to gut and replace at this point?
Well, so there's no legislation out there as we sit today. And I won't go out on a limb to say that there's no language that someone could not gut and amend. At this point, I don't think there's any NCTD specific legislation that I've seen that's been proffered, but I would not say there's no possibility.
And, the other thing to keep in mind is that the Steve Peace Bill, I think 1703 is that what it was, in 2002. I think that most people recognize that it didn't work. It wasn't all it was cracked up to be, and that for someone to try something big like that again is probably very unlikely. So that would be my hope, because I think the people that pay the price for this sort of
CP thing.
decision making are the people who ride both of the transit systems. So let's hope that we're very careful about how anything comes to be.
So just as a history lesson, seeing how I was on the board and was part of that negotiation and lost it pretty badly. This Steve Peace wanted to basically consolidate NCTD, MTS, and move all the planning functions and construction functions to Sandag, and he won. Steve Peace was a state senator from San Diego area, and it was like his last piece of legislation.
Okay, so we did have a motion. Did I hear a second to that motion?
To the substitute motion?
Yeah, the substitute.
That basically says that we accept the staff's recommendation and then send a letter to Sandag saying we support this existing legislation.
So that is the substitute motion. There is a second part to this presentation before voting on
Oh,
this
okay.
item,
Sorry.
but we'll reserve, that is the substitute motion that's on the table.
Okay,
you.
very good.
All right. So real quick, I'll go over the discretionary grant strategy for calendar year 2020. Here is an overview of our grant activity over the past 12 months split by project category and number of applications. Double tracking represents a majority of the pie, mostly given the relatively higher costs associated with those types of projects. This specific application was the Bataquitos Lagoon double tracking, which was included as part of the regional submittal to the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program. Additionally, NCTD and Sandag have jointly submitted applications requesting funding for stabilization of the Delmar Bluffs 8 times since 2016, including 4 times in the last 12 months. So our project priorities for 2020 include the Delmar Bluff stabilization, as well as Los San Corridor right-of-way improvements such as double tracking and bridge replacements, bus fleet replacement, including both state of good repair, as well as procurement of zero emission buses for pilot testing, and then customer amenities such as static and digital wayfinding and real-time arrival information. NCTD is continuing to work with Sandag, Caltrans, and other state partners to identify state programs in which the Delmar Bluff stabilization is a competitive project. There are also several shovel-ready double tracking projects along the Los San corridor, which would compete well within many of the programs that emphasize transformative capital projects. So a few key upcoming submittals include the Delmar Bluff stabilization, which we're submitting with Caltrans and Sandag to the USDOT's infra program, and then 2 hydrogen bus procurement projects, which includes the procurement of 8 hydrogen 45-foot buses to the FTA's low or no emission bus program and bus facilities program. And with that, we have the staff recommendation that the Board of Directors adopt and authorize staff to implement the calendar year 2020 legislative agenda and receive the calendar year 2020 discretionary grant strategy.
So I'd like to just restate the substitute motion for the board's clarity. The staff recommendation is to approve the legislative agenda, which includes the approval of support of the maintenance of the existing enabling legislation, and the added piece of it that the board has placed as a substitute motion is to direct staff to prepare a written letter for the board's collective signatures that can be sent to Sandag in support of the maintenance of the existing legislation.
I'm okay if Tony just signs it.
Okay.
Is that all
And
right?
yeah, that's great. And then that was a motion by Board Member Desmond and a second by Vice Chair Feller. And I don't know if the board has any questions about this part 2 presentation. No. All right. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.
So we will now vote.
On the motion of Board Member Desmond, seconded by Board Member Vice Chair Feller, to approve Agenda Item 10, motions passes with all board members present voting yes.
Okay, Board Member Bob Patel has a quick question.
So in regards to the letter, I know that the city of Carlsbad was considering also submitting a letter in support of that. And so we're just wondering if you would want to ask other cities to sign on. And if so, then I know that the city of Carlsbad would be happy to submit a support letter. So I just wanted to at least make that, an option if we wanted to go forward with it. So.
Thanks for letting us know. And I think letters from all the jurisdictions in the North County Transit District's area would be helpful. Everybody might have a different idea about whether to send it or not. We do, although as representatives, it wouldn't hurt to have a city letter if that's what you feel compelled to do. Thanks to Priya.
Could we ask staff to send sample letters to our city staffs?
Yeah. That came from all three of us over here, just saying.
Okay, very good.
Okay, I just wanted to make a couple of presentation comments before we close up that item. First, I want to tell Katie she did a great job. One of the things I just wanted to touch upon when we did this presentation, we also wanted to use it as an opportunity to kind of let you know how the transit system operates in both North County and South County. You know, kind of this whole misnomer about people zooming across the county from a public transit point of view. There's a lot of thought process and good thought process that went into the development of this transit agency, and I'm talking about well before me, so nothing attributable to me. But if you look at the services that are how they are designed, you have distinct services to meet the specific needs of North County. So you have the coaster service that was created to allow people parallel into 5 to be able to commute between North County and South County, primarily for peak business travel. And yes, it also supports recreational and special events travel, but you have a commuter rail line that was designed specifically to support that initiative and need within the region. You have the Sprinter line going east-west that bisects all of those inland cities, supports all of those major educational institutions and opportunities for jobs specifically designed for that. You have a bus system that's designed to specifically meet the needs and the unique nature of the characteristics. And then you saw some interspersing of some regional services that have been designed, for example, the BRT services that connected out at Escondido Transit Center. Now, in terms of route planning for the region, all of those routes like the BRTs are routes that get identified by SANDAG. They identify those routes. They work with the transit agencies to implement those routes. Those routes are typically funded. Actually, they're all funded through the Transnet program, but that's how they're designed. But if you take a look again at our transfer analysis and what it tells you is that about 80% of our customers stay totally within North County. And then you have the transfers of about 11% that are taking place within South County. And we have specifically designed service and transfer agreements with MTS that makes it very seamless from a customer riding experience. Because for me, I wouldn't want you guys to take a position on something just because we're North County, they're South County. There's a ton of efficiencies that Katie identified that we do to try to leverage costs when we do things together that allow us to share cost and benefits of services. So those are all good news stories for us. So I just wanted to make sure I made that comment. Finally, on the second piece of the discretionary grant strategies, those are becoming really, really political processes, the ones at the federal point of view. California is largely been shut out, a lot of those initiatives. And the process of awarding a grants are taking significant amount of time. And then we'll give you an example. If you recall that NCTD, LoSAN, and Metrolink, we all partnered on a grant for mobility on demand grant for application, an integrated traveler app. We submitted that last year, mid-year. No announcements have been made about that award for that. And so we're seeing these things take longer and longer time for the announcements to take place. Some of these we're waiting for example, Air Pollution Control District related to the last 2 locomotives that we want to replace within our system. We know that process is going to move. That's a locally state-driven process. But these processes are crapshoots, and I think what we'll do next year is we'll show you our percentage of success for the amount of grants that we sought. But a lot of this still goes back to grassroots and trying to leverage as much as we can. It's still a heavy hurdle, but it does not hurt for us to continue to reach out and advocate and leverage, the different affiliations that we have within the district to try to help bring home more money.
Okay, and adding on to that, what I heard you say is that we have professional staffs in both MTS and NCTD that work together to identify transit deserts and try and affect change there. I do know that I got an email from someone who was regularly trying to travel to the medical offices along the 56 in Carmel Valley, and that was difficult for her to get to. So I think you told me that's being looked at currently.
It absolutely is. So one of the things that we are trying to address, because we've had significant discussions going back from Board Member Drucker about the One Paseo, the La Jolla areas. And so as part of our strategic multimodal transit implementation plan, we're looking at cell phone data to understand trip patterns. And so we're looking to come forward with a pretty significant proposal program that we would like to begin the implementation next year. Now, some of this is premised upon these community partners stepping forward, like our partners in Carlsbad, and bringing dollars to the table. But we're ready to move that program forward significantly.
Great, thank you. If there are no more comments, we will move on to item number 11, informational item, quarterly safety and security report presented by Sean Loofborough, the Chief of Safety.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This will be a review of second quarter statistics for fiscal year 20, which covers October, November, and December of last year. We'll go over our quarterly trends. We'll review the hazards for near miss and trespassing, talk a little bit about current crimes and law enforcement activity, review fare evasion data, talk about security details, some overtime that we've been working on the Sprinter side, talk a little bit about accidents, and then some studies and proposals that we're working on, including the trespasser mitigation study, some towing initiatives, signage, and citations. Here's the trends for, again, this is quarter two, so it's October, November, December of 2019. We're down in preventable accidents on the bus side, slightly up on non-preventable accidents on the bus side, and then slight increases for non-preventable accidents on the rail for both Sprinter, Metrolink, and Amtrak. Here's the summary for the year for the San Diego subdivision. That's the coaster, again, running from Oceanside down to Santa Fe Depot. There's the near miss, fairly consistent near miss reporting throughout the year. And then trespassers, you do see during the summer months an increase and then sort of stabilizes towards the end of the year. And that's a summary, again, for the San Diego subdivision or the coaster. Here's the same chart for the Escondido sub, where the Sprinter line, which runs from Oceanside to Escondido. There's the near miss, also fairly consistent throughout. Trespassers moving up towards the end of the year. We typically see that once the schools come back in session, we see an increase in trespassers, and then it begins to drop down. Again, these are just total trespasser reports. That's actually not numbers of trespassers. These reports can have multiple people associated with it, so it's just the number of reports that we do receive. Here's a summary of Part 1 crimes for the quarter. You can see October through December all the way on the right. Slightly down from the previous quarter as far as the breakdown. The bulk of our reports do come either larceny or theft, with a handful of other types of crimes included in there as well.
Individuals, I guess, like
it depends on the crime.
Larceny,
So yeah, if
theft,
it's on our property and it meets the threshold of a Part 1 crime, it's reported as such. The arson, for example, is typically on our property. So that would, we did have somebody that tried to set a fire at one of our stations. Person was apprehended by the sheriffs and is actually working through the court system now. So it's either crimes to people on our property or our property itself, depending on what the category is.
Thanks. Sorry.
Here's a summary of the law enforcement activity for both San Diego Sheriff's, Oceanside, and Escondido for the quarter. Again, lots of folks. That includes arrest report, citation, and then field interviews, and then the total is on the right. Here's the HH utilization. So this is for how we validate compass cards when we tap to make sure people have the appropriate fare. This would be for the rail modes. You can see the no fare is the red wedge of the pie. It's right around 8%. We did enact a change where we're actually capturing those folks that have no fare. So we actually have a dead card that we tap so we can capture the data of somebody that doesn't have a fare. So we feel that this is a much more accurate reflection of what our actual policy is. And then I have a little expansion on what we're doing to try to address some of these fare evasion challenges on a couple slides coming up. Okay, here's the fare evasion for bus. So this is a little busy, so I'll walk you through that. So you see the blue stacks as you go across the bottom. Those are the different routes, and those are the total number of riders. The red line is the actual fare evasion numbers that were reported by those coach operators. So if somebody comes on the bus that doesn't have the fare or they're short on fare, they hit a button in the RTMS and we track that. So on the right, you'll see the actual percentage of fare evasion. So it starts at 0 and goes up to 1.2%. So you can see for most of the routes, the fare evasion total is hovering between 0.5 and about 1% for our routes. And then again, the big blue stack is the total number of riders for each of those routes. This is a sample for 1 month just for December. And this is what we use to focus our law enforcement activities for certain routes that do have challenges with folks that don't want to pay fare.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Is there a dollar amount, approximate total dollar amount on the fare evasion?
I'd have to get the total for that. If it was $225 for a single trip, we could get the total number and come up with that. I don't know what it is. I don't have the exact number right now, but that would be one way that we could calculate it. We could take the total number of fare evaders and assume a one-way trip, and then we could come up with a dollar amount, but I don't have that. I'd have to look at the data in the back. So it's, out of the total ridership and out of 1%, I'd have to look at it. I don't want to stagger to guess what the number would be. We've had some additional Sprinter overtime details. So we did phase 1 last fall from August through October, and we're currently doing phase 2 now. Summary of phase 1 that we did, we have 51 different security operations with 983 hours dedicated to the Sprinter with the San Diego Sheriff's Department. Resulted in 7 arrests, 12 citations, and 180 fare evasion warnings. 56 were for hard warnings, and then 124 for failure to tap warnings. So that's always a challenge, making sure that people have fare, understand that they need to tap appropriately depending on the mode to make sure that fare gets counted. Phase 2 has started for January 2020, so they were already working, focusing mostly on the Breeze and Sprinter modes, doing the same type of overtime details, and a future report will have a summary of those events. Here's a summary for accidents. So for the quarter, we had 5 on the rail side, 4 fatal, 1 non-fatal, which was Sprinter, resulting in 408 minutes of delay, which is 6 hours and 48 minutes. For the overall year, for calendar year 2019, there was 19 accidents. 16 of those were fatal. You'll see the breakdown there. Total result was over 2,000 minutes of delay, and that's just for the incident trains. That doesn't include the cascading effect of multiple trains, depending on the time of day and if there were other trains affected. And that totaled 35 and a half hours. Fairly consistent with our 5-year average as far as number of accidents. The fatalities were up this year a little bit from what we've seen over the 5 years. And we're still just under 2 hours as far as by the time the law enforcement's able to get there, clear the scene, get the appropriate folks notified, and get that incident train moving. So we will continue to try to improve that process to minimize the impacts on our customers for these types of events. On the bus side, we had 46 accidents, 14 were preventable and 32 non-preventable. That is below what we've seen for 5-year average for both preventable and non-preventable, so that's good. And we'll continue to work with our bus contractor to make sure we can continue to see those numbers decrease. Trespasser mitigation study is ongoing. So as a reminder, we started back in October. We had 3 specific locations we were looking at in Oceanside, Encinitas, and Del Mar. We received a draft site conditions report, and we did a workshop a couple weeks ago to review potential risk reduction alternatives. It was a productive meeting that we had. We have a final report that will be due to us to the 1st. I know I've worked with some of your city managers that want to review the report, so that'll be available for comment. And then it's scheduled to come to the board in April, combined with another item with some key fencing at some of these locations. So we will have the trespasser mitigation study results that will be combined with that item. Towing and signage. So we've executed 4 towing contracts with 4 different companies. That covers all of our parking lots, platforms, and stations throughout the service area. There's the sample signs. They're in production right now. Once they're produced, we'll go ahead and install them. And then we will start coordinating with the appropriate tow truck companies for those folks that are not following the rules. In addition, we had some additional suicide prevention signs created, and those are being installed as we speak on the Escondido subdivision. So all of our stations will have the signage for folks, which will have that crisis hotline number for them to call should they desire.
So how long can somebody, if somebody gets on Oceanside Transit Center and goes down to, I don't know, the airport and flies away for a week and leaves their car at the transit center, is that, so what's our time limit on, I guess, parking at the different stations?
Yes.
Yes, what?
So it's based on the language that's in Ordinance 3, I believe,
yeah.
which is the parking ordinance. And I don't want to speculate on what I'd have to pull the ordinance.
So
and actually read it.
in general, our policy is no overnight parking.
Oh.
There are people who do call in and request and get permission to be able to park for longer than overnight. But in general, we have not been enforcing. And so we've been taking the steps over the last couple of years towards implementation of managed parking. So the next steps will be implementation of managed parking, including issuing of citations, towing, collecting fees. So we will be moving to formalize it from a system-wide basis. That's why you're seeing these steps from us, is the step-by-step effort towards implementing managed parking on the corridor.
So right there now, there is no overnight parking.
That's what we say from a policy point of view, that there is none, but there is some.
Well, and I don't know, is this a public option to call in? I don't know.
Yeah,
Well,
it's in the rider's guide. It details who you need to call if you want overnight parking. So that is in the rider's guide for folks
Oh.
to use, and we do have customers that do
Is
that.
that one night? I don't know. I'm just.
No, it depends on what the request is.
Oh, okay. All right. Thanks.
Thank you. Matt, with the implementation of managed parking, are you talking about manned parking lots, or are you talking about gated with tickets, or?
This is going to be a phased implementation of this. I can tell you from a bottom line, we want to minimize the operating costs for this for sure. The original intent is we want to be able to give transit users essentially a 18 to 24 hour period to be able to ride. In some locations, we may designate short-term parking and have an associated fee with it. Some areas, depending on availability of space, we might even have some long-term parking. But we're looking at different tools, and our focus is to integrate it with the new Init system. So it may be the case like you see in downtown Oceanside, where there's a station, a fare payment station where you go in and put your stall number. So we're looking at all those different alternatives. Some locations may be conducive to gates, like Poinsettia stations more conducive to gates than some of the other locations that we have. So you're going to see different pieces of equipment and approaches at different stations as we move forward.
Okay, thank you.
Here's the 2000 summary of the citations. So our law enforcement partners wrote nearly 1,800 citations. There's the breakdown as far as the different organizations and how many they did. In addition, we've started PC 832 training for Bombardier employees. So we had 17 that went through in January, and we're scheduling folks for additional courses throughout the summer, as well as the agency refining its concept of operations on how we actually track and issue those citations. The administrative citation program is a separate project. We have the scope of work that's under review and the independent cost estimate. I just have a draft that's been developed, and we're looking to post that in May, and that would be for a program for administrative citations for the district, which could include parking as well as other violations of board ordinances. And that is all I have, pending any questions. Yes, sir.
2 mics now. Why does Oceanside have so many citations?
Because the Oceanside Police Department is very active in making sure that people are following the rules. And so because we have the overtime positions there by the officers at OTC, they're using that to their advantage to issue citations for those that don't want to follow the rules.
Thank you.
And I had a question about the, there was a slide here that talked about a phase 1 security.
For the Sprinter. Yes.
And do we have any, what are the metrics that we use to know whether this effort is worth the time? Are we recapturing more fare? Do riders feel safer? Are there?
Absolutely. I think both in answer to your question. So we did receive a lot of positive feedback through customer service and to the law enforcement officers themselves that they appreciated the increased presence, not only on the revenue vehicles themselves, but some of the platforms and stations. In addition, I think longer term, we'll have to see what the impact is to fare evasion. I don't know that we're going to see it within the next month or two, but I think as we see, the goal would ultimately to reduce fare evasion and make sure that people are compliant. In addition to, if they need to, make sure that they're tapping appropriately which is sort of those soft reinforcements that the Sheriff's Department was giving. So we did get feedback, which was good from the customers. And I think longer term, we will see the fruits of our labor as far as the lower fare evasion for all the modes.
Excellent.
I'm going to use this mic this time. Where are most of our trespassers?
On the railroad right-of-way, on the San Diego subdivision, in those 3 locations that we're doing the trespasser
Right.
mitigation study.
Okay. The bus drivers, when they're driving, do they make a stop? It said you had quite a few fare evasion or whatever the term is. How do they get by the bus driver?
So our policy is they state the fare twice, and then they acknowledge on the RTMS of that person, or if it's a conductor on a train, they will log that as a person with no fare. So they say, "Hello, sir, it's whatever the appropriate fare is." If they don't try to walk by, they restate the fare, and then they're allowed to board. And then we capture that data through the RTMS on the bus specifically that person didn't pay. And then we feed that data in, and then we use law enforcement to help target that, to try to minimize the potential of any confrontation that's unnecessary for our customer and our coach operator.
A kinder, gentler nation. Prevent or non-prevent accidents.
Yes.
What's a preventable accident?
So preventable would be something based on the incident and the investigation that the operator in general could have done to prevent that accident. Whereas non-preventable essentially means that the operator of that vehicle could not do anything to prevent that accident. So in the case of a train, if somebody was to walk in front of the train and the engineer had no time to brake and there was a strike, that's generally a non-preventable because there was nothing they could have done. Whereas if it was a coach operator and maybe they were following too close and they had a slight rear end accident where they hit somebody, they were following too close, they violated one of the rules, and therefore that would be categorized as a preventable accident.
Okay, thank you.
Board Member Jenkins.
2 questions. When you discuss law enforcement and Sprinter security detail, are those our NCTD contracted sheriffs, or are those in collaboration with?
In general, it's mostly our team, but for the one that they did in the fall, there was they didn't have enough coverage, so they had other sheriffs that were either on patrol at one of the other stations. They would then get indoctrinated to say, "Hey, this is what we're trying to do." But in general, most of that was covered by our contracted SDSO through the NCTD ones. But they did have some additional support from the other sheriff's units for that phase.
Okay. And then question on the parking lot. If I remember from several months ago, some of the issues we have is people actually storing
Yes.
vehicles,
Boats, lawnmowers, whatever it may
some
be.
without tires, and
Yes.
so this is going to be able to address all that also.
Yes.
It's not necessarily just cars.
Correct.
Okay.
Absolutely. Anybody that's not following the prescribed rules, whether it be motorhomes taking up 14 spaces, people parking at an angle, it will address all of that.
Okay, a couple comments having to do with language. In the Vision Zero world, where we're looking to reduce incidents of crashes that injure people, it has been suggested that the term accident needs to be phased out and start talking about crashes. It is intended to shift the conversation a little bit to recognize that this is something that really isn't, we shouldn't write off with the phrase like accident. I don't know if it'd be possible to implement that language here, but.
Well, there are some regulatory guidelines that very specifically say how we have to report that. And unfortunately, I don't know that I could get around that based on not only on the rail side, but National Transit Database as well.
And it probably, those are the sort of things that require you to talk about trespassers, which is another euphemism in the railroad industry. And in Encinitas, the folks that are trespassing call themselves beachgoers and diners, because they're trying to get from their homes on the east side of the track to either the beach or the restaurants that are on the west side of the track. So I would expect that our meeting in April is probably going to be well attended. And so these conversations about mitigation for trespassers is sure to be robust.
Absolutely.
Are you ready?
Always ready.
Imagine you are.
Okay, thank you, Sean.
Thanks.
And moving on to item 12, it is going to be a presentation on passenger rail operations, and it will be led by our fearless Executive Director, Mr. Tucker.
All right, yeah, I'm Matt. I have a quick introduction for our speaker. Deutsche Bahn is one of the world's largest railway operators, transporting over 7.3 million passengers on trains and buses in Germany, and moving over 1 million metric tons of goods by rail throughout Germany and Europe on an average weekday. Building upon the 180 years of experience of the Deutsche Bahn Group, DB Engineering and Consulting is a global provider of customized infrastructure, mobility, and logistics solutions. DB has extensive international engineering and consulting experience, with their work represented in projects in over 100 countries since 1966. In November 2018, the Lausanne Rail Corridor Agency selected DB to provide corridor optimization support services for the Lausanne Corridor. Ulrich Leister, VP Head of Consulting at DB Engineering and Consulting USA, will provide an overview of rail operations fundamentals, as well as an update on the corridor optimization work effort related to the coaster and sprinter corridors.
And I would just say, as Ulrich comes up, this presentation is an item that's been specifically designed to help give you a ton of context about Rail Operations 101. It's a timely presentation given the discussions in the region about rail. It will help you understand some of the bigger concepts that are being discussed. And then we will pivot, he will pivot into some of the activities that we can do. So I want to really just set the stage for you. This is something for you to focus your attention on, because this will give you a greater understanding and ability to ask good questions when we talk about different solutions in public transit that involve rail.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, board members. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you today. I am local here. I'm with Deutsche Bahn, the German rail operator in their consulting division. However, I have been living here in Southern California for the last 5 years and have done a bunch of work throughout California, but also on the Lausanne corridor. I'm here today to give a presentation about rail operations and rail operations planning specifically. I'm covering quite a bit of material, so excuse me if for some parts of it I'll try to go a little faster. I've been told I have about 35 to 40 minutes, so this is a comprehensive block of material here. When we start thinking about planning for railroads and public transportation networks generally, the first question we need to ask ourselves is really, why does somebody want to take a train and public transportation? And the answer to that is if it provides convenient service, competitive journey times, and consistent quality. And I'll get into all of those components, what this really means. In places where we achieve networks that meet these three success criteria, we get to put out advertisements like this. And this is an example from Zurich, where the regional network provider there puts out advertisements like saying, with the tram in Zurich, you're faster than every sports car, or some things are only funny when you're riding with us, like blinding your dad that would otherwise be on the steering wheel. And also just generally saying when the day ends differently than it began, you can still use public transportation because it provides convenient service, competitive journey times, and consistent quality, or a consistent service throughout the day, throughout the week, and throughout the year. These things are funny, but show that good networks cater to very different uses, like families on a leisure trip and people who want the flexibility to just take a later train back home at night and still have that option. So before I go into the key strategies and the key elements behind achieving such networks, let's take a quick look at the official definitions. And I'll read those out because this is very small font here. These are the official definitions of the American Public Transportation Association and the International Union of Railroads. They define light rail as passenger rail on fixed rail in right-of-way that is often separated from other traffic for part or much of the way. Heavy rail as electrified passenger rail. It is characterized by high speed and rapid acceleration on exclusive rights-of-way with capacity for heavy volume of traffic. They define commuter rail as urban passenger train service consisting of local short distance travel operating between a central city and adjacent suburbs. Service is operated on a regular basis. The service is usually provided through locomotive hauled or self-propelled electric or diesel railroad cars. Most service is provided on routes of current or former freight railroads. And then finally, high-speed rail. In 1994, APTA defines high-speed passenger rail as service provided on exclusive rights-of-way operating at speed of 124 miles per hour and greater. What's obvious with all of those definitions is that they're highly influenced by what rail services look like. What a light rail looks like, what heavy rail, what commuter rail, and so forth looks like. I would argue that customers see public transportation networks differently. They would probably, as the first touch point, see it like this, as a Google query, either online or on your desktop, where you just want to find out how you get from A to B. And all you see is there is an option in an hour that gets me there in an hour or something like that. So a big focus needs to be to make sure that this picture here is convincing. And the right way to start to make public transportation networks that are convenient, competitive, and provide consistent quality is to think less about technology and vehicles and more about service types and layers of service. And to walk you through here, this is actually work that's taken from the California State Rail Plan. You can think about a first layer of service to be local service, something like San Diego's trolley service, and to some extent also something like the Sprinter service that makes frequent stops every 1 to 3 miles, runs frequently, often every 15 minutes or even less, but achieves also average speeds that are just somewhere between 15 and 40 miles per hour. Then another layer of service, which you could call regional service. Often here, those regional services are commuter services, but that already implies that they're just for a single purpose. But regional services that have stopping intervals only every 3 to 6 miles, cover a longer distance, achieve higher speeds, run frequently as well, ideally every 15 minutes, maybe only every 30, still providing good service, or just every 60 minutes during off peaks. And then a layer of inner city services, services that are intended to cover longer distances, achieving higher average speeds. And I talk about average speeds here because max speeds don't really matter. That's sometimes an interesting characteristic, but what matters, whether you're really competitive in terms of the journey time, is your average speed. How long does it take me to get from point A to point B? And for those inner city services, of course, they need to achieve higher average speeds to be competitive with stopping intervals that are just maybe every 20 to 30 miles. So something similar to what the Pacific Surfliner in the Lausanne corridor is today. With then also frequencies that could be every 30 minutes or just every 60 minutes, or in areas where such frequent service is not warranted, maybe just every 2 hours.
Excuse me, I'd like to speak a little bit more about some of this stuff, call attention to some things here. When I served on the Lausanne board, there was always an argument about whether we should be using the Pacific Surfliner as a regional commuter rail service. We did at one point have Pacific Surfliner stopping at all of our commuter stations, and eventually that service went away. There still is an ability to use Pacific Surfliners, but it no longer stops at all of the commuter rail stations. So, and when you look at this graph here, and you especially want to look at that high-speed rail, because high speed has been kicked around a little bit here as part of the 5 big moves. you see that the stopping interval is 100 to 150 miles, and that's a distance that far exceeds our region. So just the conversation about high-speed rail is essentially a non-starter, but we should be focusing on that 5 big moves as part of the conversation about enhancing the corridors, because that's an important part of it. But we do provide a service in each of the corridors, a couple of the corridors that is really critical.
Thank you. And yes, high-speed rail as the last layer of service that really is intended to be competitive with flying or with long-distance car trips, where such a service can potentially provide superior travel times, where you have this very long distances and frequencies that may just be once an hour or even just once every 2 hours between specific origin and destination pairs. All of those layers of service, of course, need to be well integrated and well connected. None of those are a layer that you roll out independently of everything else and build up barriers around it. No, it needs to be one cohesive network where you may be on a local service connecting to an intercity service, and you are making an intercity trip, but as a passenger piecing those different elements together. Systems, again, going back to competitive journey times, convenience, and consistent quality. I want to give you a quick example of the region of Zurich again. I have a few Swiss examples built in here, or European examples, where in their strategic plan, they detail this further out, what elements or what components are the basis of those 3 main success factors. On competitive trip times, of course, providing direct connections where you can, and that's the big caveat here, where you cannot always and everywhere provide frequent direct connections, and therefore it's equally important to optimize transfers between services. In terms of easy and convenient use, one important factor is providing repetitive so-called pulse schedules. I'll get into this into more detail because this is a key element that connects a lot of those things, and that is a key element behind the LOCEN optimization study as well. So pulse schedules, meaning services operate repetitively every 30 minutes or every hour, and you have a consistent pattern throughout the day. I'll get into more detail on that. And then consistent high quality, which is defined as providing long hours of service, dense services or frequent services, and guaranteeing connections and providing reliable service. So there are a few components here that are equally as important. They are influenced by how we plan the service, but then also how it's being delivered. And one key component in all of this are pulse timetables, repetitive timetables. They touch on the easiness and convenience of using, but they're also a key element to optimize transfers, because that's what they're for, to set up a transfer to work once and then repeat this every hour, every half an hour consistently throughout the day.
Analysis on, okay, and it all sounds good. You have pulse, you have repetitive, you have every 30 minutes, you have, but do you have like statistics on where this works and what types of populations? So, you know, Zurich and Paris and, you know, all these places that have great metros and things like that. But and I don't know how that compares to San Diego County, where we're much more spread out, and we don't have the concentrations of people like New York or Paris or even Zurich here. And so it is at a certain point, you know, I don't know if it's all of these European systems are 100% subsidized or not. And I guess where, you know, I don't know if every 30 minutes it's going to work for us, or we'd be at such a loss that it's, you know, right now Coaster runs a lot in the morning and a lot in the evening when people go to and from work. And I don't know if every 30 minutes during the day is really feasible. So I don't know if you get into that analysis later, but we always hear, well, here's the way Europe does it, but do they still have the same concentrations of people that like we have? We're much more spread out than some of these other places that we're compared to. So hopefully, I know you got 40 pages to go here.
Yes, and so so what I would just say, that's not this presentation.
Okay.
We do have information, and I think if you could kind of suffer with us until about April when we come back with our strategic multimodal transit implementation plan. We're going to be able to talk a little bit more about the specifics of this region, looking at specific cell phone data, which you then break down the trip patterns, and then understanding what the market can realistically yield in terms of additional riders for different types of services. That's where the discussion is going to be. I would agree with you about we can't draw these false conclusions between this happens in Europe and so this can happen in the US. That's not what we're going to be proffering. What we're going to be proffering is more of an analytical base based upon the information that we get from folks within the San Diego region to give us a projection of what we can do to attract additional riders to the types of services that are needed within this area.
Well, and there may be comparisons of other parts of the world that have similar, you know, I don't know, types of populations and cities and densification. That would give us a better I think, basis for analysis to whether or not this is going to work or not for us.
It's a difficult thing, but I don't want to prolong the discussion. So
okay. Well, I just hear about all these great things, but it's really going to work here. Okay, go ahead.
So I, first of all, I'm more than happy to get into this conversation. These are like longer answers, obviously. And bringing the facts is also, there are a lot of facts to bring. What I am going into is the planning framework and approach. And part of that needs to be, of course, making the economic case as well. Absolutely. It's not a detached thing. Just to briefly get into one or two topics about the density, places like Switzerland. I lived in Switzerland before coming here 5 years ago. I now live in Laguna Niguel in Orange County, so I am well aware of suburban California. The region of Zurich is not a big city. It's about 450,000 people in a greater region of 1.5 to 2 million, depending on how you count the different counties there, with a number of areas that have quite low densities, where villages of 200-300 people are connected to that sort of system, where a bus goes through once an hour at least, or every half an hour, runs to the closest train station, where then you have service once an hour at least, usually more every 30 minutes or even every 15 minutes. And really the connectivity and bringing all sorts of demands from going from a place A, B, C, and D to X, Y, Z, bringing all those together and bundling them creates the efficiencies that allows the frequencies. And that's why both the repetitive timetables and the connectivity are so important, because they unlock a lot of those possibilities.
And what kind of fare box recovery is I guess later.
Later, but happy to provide the facts there because they're not bad. And Switzerland is, as you may know or not know, a fiscally very conservative country with very low taxes. So they are a good comparison to some extent. Going into the pulse scheduling and the details there and providing those elements, it is an important approach that brings together a number of those success factors. We talked about I talked about some of the benefits on the passenger side, that it's just simpler to use, it's more intuitive, but equally as important, there are real benefits to providing repetitive, more simplified and standardized service on an operation side as well. First of all, by providing connections more consistently, services are able to create a more extensive market reach. Vehicle utilizations are almost always better because the rotations of the vehicle are better, and also there are benefits to punctuality. And lastly, and often from my perspective, most importantly, a pulse type schedule with repetitive services is also the best way to use capacity and use the infrastructure in the optimal fashion, and have a tool to do good planning. And this is what this next section is about, to be able to identify what investments truly make sense. Because investing in rail infrastructure, and specifically when it's about rail, always takes a long time and costs a lot of money, and those projects are better exactly what you need to unlock better service. To get into briefly just explaining this connections and connectivity by design versus connectivity by coincidence concept, I just want to explain this repetitive character. A pulse schedule has different locations, key locations in the network where all the services come together and provide an ability for passengers to transfer. So, and let me see if this. So, for example, and this could be Oceanside, train services come together just before the top of the hour. Buses approach the station as well. At the top of the hour, trains are in the station, buses are there, connections are being made possible between the services, and just shortly after, all the services leave again. And that happens not only once, but happens repetitively throughout the day, so that even people who want to make a trip that involves a transfer know what to do every time, every hour, or every half an hour when these services operate. To make this, put this into context, this is also the adopted by now vision of the state with the most recent state rail plan, where a network of repetitive pulsed services throughout California, making key connections at key locations, is the vision for 2040, and subsets of that for the implementation years. International benchmark examples, and sorry, going too fast here, like Switzerland, bring us or give us a lot of understanding what the effects are of those sort of systems. And to make that a little more tangible, I brought a quick video of these transfers as well. You have to excuse it's shot by myself a few years ago with an iPhone a few generations back, so it still shakes a little. And you know that they now have really good algorithms and software to prevent this. So question is, how do I get this started? Okay, perfect. So this is an example from a suburban station south of Zurich, where twice an hour, exactly that kind of delay that I showed before happens, where buses arrive, in this case here, around minute 45 and minute 15. Buses are come in, and then train services come into the station. This is actually a station that has roughly a similar layout like Oceanside, with a corridor that goes north-south, 2 different lines on that corridor that go into different directions, and then a third line that comes in and terminates at that station. So within a few minutes, all the services come in. The station is occupied by 5 trains in total. Everybody gets, or a lot of people get off, transfer to either the other trains that go into other directions or onto buses. And then within a few minutes, everything departs again and the station empties out, where first all of the different train services, one is a more express, one a more local going into the direction of Zurich, leave. And then lastly, a few minutes later, the buses leave the station. The buses here, maybe take a look on the inside. They're not completely packed because this is 10:30 in the morning or 10:45, but they still have quite a few passengers riding it because it caters to a whole sort of different needs, not just commuting to work, but also leisure trips, business trips, shopping, visiting a doctor, and so forth. So question is this something that's possible in Oceanside? I would say absolutely yes, but it needs planning and thinking behind it. And I want to go quickly into the approaches that are necessary to do planning for such systems and evaluate what their benefit is. First of all, effective planning is, from our point of view, driven by service and operations. So thinking about what is the product, the service that we want to offer, how can we produce this, how can we operate it, and then deriving from that what the infrastructure is that is needed to deliver that service. Unfortunately, sometimes the opposite happens, where the infrastructure, or a lot of the focus is on the infrastructure, and the infrastructure itself becomes kind of the public transportation project. We always need to remember what people use are the services. They don't use the infrastructure, and often they care only in a negative fashion about the infrastructure because it brings impacts, but the service bring the benefits. So the key difference here in the planning approach, and that sometimes is overlooked, that in the long term, we have to think about services in detail to make sure that they meet up at the right locations to make connections, and then underlying that, how they can actually operate. Railroads are very complicated systems. That just real quick. There are a lot of variables to cover, and that is one of the key downsides really of railroads. They have important advantages, just the ability to move a lot of people, the environmental advantages, but a railroad has key downsides as well, and this is the complexity often of the system and the need to define things often long terms out, because if you want to build infrastructure, if, for example, you want to have the ability for one train to overtake another, you have to build the physical infrastructure for that train to get around the other. And that often needs to happen 5-10 years in advance to be really ready when you need it. So long-term planning is key, and it is key to think about service and the actual operations often many years out to get something by 2025 or by 2030 in the ground and service that is truly better than what you have today. The way we approach this, and the way this was approached also on the LOSAN optimization study, is to put the actual service plan or timetable or operating plan, depending on who you talk to. Those things have different names, even within an organization, to put that at the center. This means, when are the trains running? That's important for customers. And it's also important for the operators, because they need to know, can we run those trains? Do we have the infrastructure in place to do it? And it always needs to start, again, with the service goals. What do we want to achieve? Do we want to achieve a service? And this, at that point, anything can and should be defined. Should it be targeted only at a specific market? Should it be a frequent service? Should it be something else? It needs to start with those service goals that need to be directly translated into an actual timetable and operating plan or concept. And from that, we derive the technology, the vehicle technology, the infrastructure, and also elements of network capacity that give us a better understanding of how resilient the services will be. So in total, this is a framework to give us to be able to specify the right infrastructure, to pinpoint the right infrastructure, to identify the required fleet, and also to identify and define requirements for customer interface and customer interface integration. So with that, I would like to go into the LOSAN optimization work and provide you an update of that study where, of course, we followed this planning approach. So on the LOSAN optimization study, which spans the entire LOSAN corridor and also includes, by amendment, the Sprinter corridor, the objectives of the work are to develop passenger service concepts for repetitive, regular interval schedules to boost service quality, service coverage, and connectivity, specify the operating needs to ensure reliable and robust operations, to make sure that the infrastructure and equipment is there to actually operate that service, and through this planning, derive the priorities for capital investments, either vehicles or, if needed, infrastructure investments. But it's obviously not a goal just to come up with infrastructure investments. That's just a necessity, a requirement to pursue service goals. And that is how it should be. We are working on 3 horizons for the LOSAN study, a so-called long-term horizon, which in this study was defined to be about 10 years out, or 2028, 2030 in this timeframe, where the goal is to provide high-frequency integrated service, which leverages larger capital and fleet improvements. We have a midterm horizon about 5 years out with the goal to expand service quality and coverage through new fleet that becomes available, and some feasible capital investments. Of course, from my point of view, I think the midterm of 5-year horizon is often the most important and sometimes also overlooked because it's the most challenging, where really you have to do the planning, where the work needs to start immediately, and where still a number of variables are open for definition, so you can really have a step improvement and not just very marginal small improvements. And then lastly, we're also working on the near-term horizon where we are working with a lot of constraints. There isn't much infrastructure expansion or anything that is possible, so you really just have to work with what you have. And there, the goal is to establish a repetitive pulse type service with timed connections. Ideally, and this is somewhat outside of the study, but the study relies on that as well, to also build the case for better ticket integration and better schedule integration. Because if we are pursuing good connections, then those soft issues need to be addressed as well to really make it simple for passengers to stitch together journeys using different pieces of the corridor. Right now, we're working on this service design. We're developing different network maps with the connectivity options. There are always trade-offs. Often you cannot get everything because things are interdependent. So we're working through a whole number of scenarios there, looking at the operational impacts and the associated infrastructure projects. And there are frequent meetings that include NCTD as a stakeholder as well. On the coaster side, I would like to zoom in to that part of the corridor real quick and give you an update there. One of the candidate concepts right now for the near term, so this is still working drafts, but are concepts that are being supported by more and more arguments, is a 20-minute service or the ability to run 20-minute service. So you have to distinguish here between what the infrastructure is able to carry and then the later decision what exactly you carry all day long. So about every 20-minute service made up of surfliner trains and coaster trains. Then I'll skip just one ahead here for the long-term concept. In the long term, and that again is about 10 years out, with assuming that a lot of the double tracking work in the San Diego area, projects that have already been started or are constantly being pursued, currently being pursued, that those projects are in place. We developed a concept that in this area of the corridor would provide the ability to run up to every 15-minute service, where one of those trains is a surfliner and 3 trains would be coaster trains in each direction. Those concepts are still obviously constrained by some of the single tracking that remains, and that constrains the corridor, not only in this place, but then through the surfliner trains that run further north, kind of export some of those constraints also further north.
So I don't understand this graph. Or whatever,
okay, yeah, sorry.
Whatever it is you're trying to tell me here, I can't get it.
And I actually overlooked my big note here.
You don't
with
have to. You don't have to. But I just.
No.
Looks like a chain link fence. And,
Called a spaghetti something or other, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay.
It's a string line chart, and I apologize because I overlooked my big exclamation mark here to explain a string line chart, which if you're used to reading those all the time, you always forget to explain it. So this is
Matt never showed us these.
So this is a way of showing or describing rail operations. It is a time distance graph. So on the horizontal axis, you have time. In this case, it shows the hours between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. or 1400. It's military time here. Don't worry about the exact times because these are just generic standard patterns that describe what the infrastructure can carry, not necessarily meaning that you run all this all day. On the vertical axis, you have distance. So at the very bottom of this chart is San Diego, and at the top of the chart is Oceanside. And every line, the blue and turquoise lines represent a train operating on the corridor, obviously operating down the corridor, and time passes as that train does that. The gray areas represent single track, where you cannot have 2 trains at the same time in these areas. And then the white areas are double track segments where trains of different directions can pass one another without influencing one another. And A lot of the work, the actual planning work, is conducted using those kinds of diagrams, and then on a full network level to think through, first of all, how trains can operate along the corridor without interfering with one another, and how you bring them into the key locations, key stations, so that they can make connections and convenient connections. So this is, I hope it makes more sense now. In the end, what I would like to describe with that is just maybe the service outcome. Again, is more important. It's the actual timetable or service you could offer to the general public. And the message here is, on the near term, this could be service of every 20 minutes. The infrastructure is able to carry that at Oceanside, Solana Beach, and San Diego, where the surfliners stop, and the other stations would get service 2 coaster trains per hour, but not a perfect distribution. It would be a 20 minutes, 40 minutes, 20 minutes, 40 minutes distribution, where yeah, you can catch a train at 8 a.m., for example, next one at 8:20, and then at 9 a.m. again.
So question, currently the Pacific Surfliners only, as we talked about earlier, only stop at Oceanside, Solana Beach, and then downtown. Isn't this, so it's kind of skewed, those extra 20-minute stops? Or are you going back, trying to go back to having them stop at every station? No? Okay.
I mean, what we're really, but what we're doing is painting an integrated vision of rail. And what we're trying to do is to look at, and I'll use one of your thought processes and I'll sound smart. We had talked about kind of the whole federated operations concept, that if you look at between NCTD, Metrolink, and Amtrak services, how to squeeze as much capacity and operational efficiency through leveraging the services. That's why when he talks about things like the integrated approach, whether it be ticketing, communications, this is just a proof of concept that you can do these things. Doesn't necessarily mean we're going to do it with only a coaster train or only a Metrolink train or only an Amtrak train. It's really going to be about how do we maximize use of the capacity on the railroad corridor. Capacity, just the same thought process you would have on the freeway, the amount of throughput that you can have in directions at any given time. It's about that whole analysis and achieving specific service outcomes. But just to be clear, Amtrak is intercity service. The notion of it operating as local service is not necessarily the highest and best use of the service if we want to reduce the travel times between San Diego and LA. What we want to do is to give different traveler choices, the types of services that they're looking for.
So there still would not be 20-minute headways, for example. You're talking about 20-minute headways twice an hour, but then you have 40 minutes till the next coaster, right?
Right. So when you talk about it, you could potentially, what you're seeing is, in certain scenarios, trains coming every 20 minutes. And maybe not every one of those trains will take you everywhere that you want to go.
Or stop for you.
Yeah.
And you know, you live in Solana Beach, so
I know
you
they
would
all-
have every
they all
20
stop
minutes.
For me. Yeah.
And for anybody who lives in Del Mar or Encinitas, if they wanted a train and it was on the other 20 that was going to be a surfliner, they might go to Solana Beach.
Well,
So
and also I think that it gives an option for what I would consider an express train. So yeah, and that's, I think I've shared with many of the board members that I lived in both Tokyo and New York for good amounts of time. And so I appreciate transit systems that have pulse, where you know you're going to be able to get on a train in 5 minutes or 15 minutes, and it's always going to be at that same 5 or 15-minute interval. I think it's really important, and I like the way that this is sounding, because I think it's simple and easier for people to understand and to work with. But it does go hand in hand with that ease of ticketing, and also with wayfinding. You have to have good wayfinding if you're talking about people getting off that bus, getting to the train, you know, and getting in the direction they need to go, especially the first time.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you very much for those comments. And this goes back also, I think, to Board Member Desmond and his comment about dense cities before, in Tokyo and New York. They are applying this, but it's also a good concept for providing actually basic connectivity throughout a network that does not provide the sort of natural demand that those super dense places provide. And that's where I would say this is actually even more important for off-peak hours when you run service maybe just once an hour, that if those services, when they operate, that they truly make all the connections, because then you really can't miss a connection. Missing means you add another hour to a trip and then it just isn't a trip anymore. It's not an option anymore.
Well, and I was in Vancouver and as was Chair Kranz for Revolution. And I was very impressed, and they're much smaller and more spread out the way that we are, but everything ran on a timetable and worked together. So it's that connectivity. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yes, and indeed it is a more, the surfliners here in this part of the corridor are an express service. They are a few minutes faster. It's not a huge difference because there are still constraints of the infrastructure, and one of the big constraints is single tracking around Del Mar that also imposes this 20 minutes kind of distribution in both directions around this area, but then towards Oceanside, the surfliners make up a bit of time, and towards San Diego as well. The long term is through diminishing or through elimination of some of those constraints, provides the ability to run service or run 4 trains an hour that are running roughly every 15 minutes, still one of those trains being a surfliner and 3 being coaster services. So the coasters here would run 15, 15, 30, 15, 15, 30, and in off-peak times, you could easily downsize this to coasters, for example, running every 30 minutes or just running once an hour, and then together with the surfliner still providing between San Diego, Solana Beach, and San Diego trains that operate evenly distributed every half an hour, where every half an hour you have an option to take a train. With that, I would like to give you a brief update on the Sprinter work as well. As I said, by amendment, the Sprinter corridor was added to this work too. And the goal here was to look at mainly 3 different concepts for improved service. To look at potential benefits of express service that operates using the freight bypass, looking at increasing frequencies to either 20 or 15 minutes, and to look for opportunities to better connect Sprinter services in Oceanside to services on the Low Sand corridor. We looked at 3 different concepts. One with this express service using the freight bypass, then a concept where we looked at what would the Sprinter corridor look like if trains operated every 20 minutes, and what would it look like if we operated every 15 minutes. The conclusion is that the 15-minute service provides the best connectivity in Oceanside and also works well with existing double track segments on the corridor already that are necessary now to operate the every 30-minute service. With that, I'll gonna confront you with another one of those colorful slides here. So this is the every 15-minute service. 2 different colors here, green and brown, that indicate new double track that would be required to make this service frequency possible from the infrastructure side. Green is what's absolutely necessary to run this, and brown was identified as areas where if you're going in and doing the work, it may make sense to just keep on and keep going and build more double track than you need at a minimum. However, increasing the resilience of the corridor for delays and disruptions. In total, here, there were also cost estimates already done. The operating cost of such a service, 15 minutes all day long, the annual operating cost would be 36.9 million, and the infrastructure cost would be 189 million. And
that 36.9 million is over a number of years. It's over, I can't remember whether there was a 3 or 5 year period for the doubling. The $189 million is associated with the 9.5 miles of double track and an additional station location that needed to be added.
yes, so the capital cost for infrastructure is 189, and that includes significant contingencies, both for each of the individual projects and then the entire package on top. So there are,
So that's to build it, but okay. You
Yeah.
haven't acquired the land yet.
No, we do. No, we do. And the right of way, we already have the right of way. The great thing about this is that a lot of the the area where we need double track is already graded and just needs to have ballast and double track
Oh,
added to the locations. So there are elements of this project that are ready for prime time to be implemented in a phased manner without having to do one big project. And that's what the appeal of it is, that we've seen, initial proposals in the regional plan between $500 to $1 billion to get to the 15-minute hitway. So we just decided to work with DB ourselves to see if there were other alternatives outside of double tracking the entire territory. And this is what we're bringing forward as a concept. The region has always assumed that we would be going to 15-minute hitways on the Sprinter. We believe we've identified a path at a much lower cost without building double track, and we didn't choose the 5.8 miles, which would allow us to do it. We wanted to be a little bit more resilient, so we went to 9.5 miles of double tracking being
How about
added.
like those by Cal State San Marcos where you fly over the freeway?
We leave that in place.
Okay, so that would not be double tracked?
That would not be double tracked, and that was one of the things we were trying to avoid. I mean, the truth of the matter is, every time you have a single track location in a railroad, that becomes a choke point for the railroad. But one of the reasons we are analytically based in that pretty string diagram that you love there gives you the proof of concept that you can actually operate the service that is being planned. Now, acknowledging that as part of the multimodal corridor study for the 78, we know Caltrans is looking potentially at relocating that crossing at Cal State San Marcos. And if they determine they need to relocate it for the highway project, we would really expect a double track project.
Oh, to be the outcome of that.
Yeah.
Okay. I think if I recall, the Sprinter costs about double from what it was originally estimated.
I think you really recall that the Sprinter project is one of the most cost-effective projects that has
Yeah.
ever been built in the United States at under $25 million a mile.
But
You
I recall it was double the cost of what it was originally estimated to be.
I wasn't here for that.
Yeah, you seem to just what that. Okay.
yeah. And we had the cost estimates here developed by a subcontractor, WSP, and by people who are very familiar with the Sprinter corridor. Then in addition to that, we were asked to put together a couple hypothetical scenarios to test the effect that higher speeds on the corridor or different rolling stock would have. For that, we actually looked at to really just carve out what the difference of these two factors would be. We looked at a hypothetical 22-mile long corridor with either 15 stations, 10 stations, or 5 stations, and looked at two different speeds, whether it would operate like it does today, up to a maximum of 55 miles per hour or up to 90 miles per hour. And here we were looking at the current rolling stock, which are Siemens DESIRO. We also looked at state-of-the-art DMUs like the Stadler Flirt, and at potentially electrified multiple units. The main difference between those rolling stock types are two things. One is their maximum speed, what they're allowed up to, the maximum speed that they're allowed to go, and equally as important, the mean acceleration that really drives the difference between run times if those vehicles are able to accelerate faster and get to those maximum speeds faster. Generally, diesel trains are slower at accelerating and electric trains are faster, and the more modern trains typically are better because there is a continuous push to get the acceleration to be better. The overview here of those different scenarios is this table. On the left-hand side, the scenarios that used a 55 miles per hour maximum speed, again, whether you have 15 stations, 10 stations, or 5 stations, and then what sort of rolling stock is used, whether it's the current train sets, a modern diesel train set, or a modern electric train set. On the right-hand side, you see the same information for 90 miles per hour. And the main insights are, first of all, that changing speeds on their own has little impact. You can see this by comparing just a 55 miles per hour scenario with current equipment. It's about 52 minutes in journey time from end to end. And it would be the same 52 minutes, even if the track speed allowed you to go up to 90 miles per hour. The reason for that is simply because the trains wouldn't even reach the maximum speed. They would need to decelerate for the next station already before they would even come close to 90 miles per hour. If vehicle technology was changed, then there is an impact. It could be between 5 minutes, for example, with the current 15 stations, or in a hypothetical case with 15 stations, it could be about 5 minutes that modern electric vehicles could do the trip in, but of course with the associated cost and so forth. And then it's always the questions, are those minutes worth it? So changing technology yields somewhere between 4 and 8 minutes if it's combined also with increased speed limits. And then lastly, what you see is that, of course, the stopping patterns have a large impact. So how many intermediate station stops you're serving have a significant impact on overall journey time. That has two reasons. One, because the trains don't need to decelerate and accelerate, and also because they don't need to stop at a station and dwell there. So that alone adds up to a few minutes if you take out 5 stops, just the time that the train actually is sitting in the station, not moving. So lastly, and I'll conclude this real fast.
So let me just
sorry.
talk a little bit about that slide, because it's important for you to kind of understand how the Sprinter operates in the ridership. When you look at the Sprinter, you got a good mix of customers who ride from Oceanside to Vista and from Vista to Escondido. If you ever ride the Sprinter, you'll see the breakout of how customers are hopping on and off of the Sprinter. You do have some customers that are riding end to end, but the vast majority of them are doing these trip pairs that are consistent with us combining a bunch of bus routes together and operating a rail system that's much more efficient. What we really wanted to highlight for you all is a lot of the discussion, because this assumes that you're making a significant investment in rail to be an exclusive right-of-way. So an exclusive right-of-way, I guess everyone would know what that means. That means there's no grade crossings, there's no interference. Think about an elevated structure all the way from Oceanside to Escondido. Think about what he's talking about when he says the modern EMU. He's talking about a whole electrification of a system. And so you're talking about spending likely billions of dollars to make a conversion, and you're going to save only a few minutes of time at the end. And it's kind of is intended to help you understand that the trade-off from likely a customer survey would be saving 5 minutes from end to end when I don't travel from end to end on it. Is not the biggest thing. It's the frequency, us going from the 30 minutes to every 15 minutes that would drive higher ridership on the Sprinter. That's what really this highlights, is you can spend a whole heck of a lot of money. Maybe you want to optimize the stops, but if you optimize the stops, then you're going to have to make bigger investments in first and last mile transportation services. That's the big deal about this, is taking this and putting this into an analytical system and producing this data so that you could clearly see what your benefits is. And then you can evaluate this against whatever someone is telling you they're proposing as a project to see your cost benefit ratio based upon the different options.
Okay. I guess I'm a bit confused. I'm sorry. Somebody had their hand up. You're saying this, I guess when you're modeling this with 55 miles an hour, 90 miles an hour, and I get what you said, Matt, there's not enough bang for the buck, even if we just make the train go faster, because it's still going to have. But I guess back in your definitions on page 7, or slide 7, where you say the local, which is, it stops every 1 to 3 miles, which the Sprinter does. That thing then averages about 15 to 40 miles an hour. Yet you're modeling at 55 and 90. But I guess this is just to show that.
That's the difference between the average speed, so really the commercial speed that you achieve, and the maximum allowed speed. So yeah. Here, the 55.
It's the first time I'm seeing this.
No,
it's
of
not
course,
all
yeah,
sinking in. So that's
and
okay.
this is
I'm just okay.
this is a really good
I'm just
question
trying
and
to say
comment
what-
because
I'm trying
those,
to tie it to what you said before to what
Mhm.
this is, and that they're just not linking up. But that's, you don't have to go through the whole thing. I'm just trying to.
yeah, but that's actually a very important
Grasp it.
element that is important to look out for. The average speed is what counts to the customer, and whether or not the train at some point runs at 100 miles per hour doesn't matter. That's just an engineering question, really, if it's safe to run at 100 miles per hour for a few minutes. What really is important is how fast are you moving from where you're going to where, or from where you're starting to where you're going. And for example, for local services where you are making frequent stops, you're typically moving just with 20 to 40 miles per hour average speed, really.
You're doing 90, you're buying a lot of brakes.
Exactly.
That's what it
yeah.
sounds like. Okay.
And you're consuming a lot of energy
Okay.
trying to get up to that speed.
Okay.
Thank you. Matt, you mentioned something, basically. So we have a lot of stops on Sprinter. They're very frequent. But you also mentioned that many of the trips are partial distances. They aren't just tiny little distances. Is it possible to have local and express trains?
Of course, you could do that. The Sprinter, actually, one of the beauties of that alignment is if you make additional investments. So I'm going to jump into just a snapshot of the vision is if you really want to build out the Sprinter, you would really look at in the future having a change in vehicle technology to make it a FRA compliant vehicle. And you would want to look at having an overlay of a commuter rail line, depending on what information would tell you in terms of trips patterns, that would allow you to be able to align that train to be able to go further north, to give people, if you can establish a sufficient market of people going north and south from some points on the San Diego subdivision to Escondido. So you could do that as you look at changing vehicle technology. It will also require you to add additional capacity above and beyond what you have today and what we're talking about here to be able to do it. But the Sprinter sets up nicely when we talk about that freight bypass track. That is the track that the short line freight railroad uses rather than going over the loop because they cannot go on the loop. And so that offers a more direct path, but it's not necessarily consistent with the travel pattern. The other piece is the 15 stops. We've looked at some of the stop analysis. There are probably a few station stops that we do believe comfortably maybe in the future, maybe we should consider, but those are also stop locations that we are also looking for development opportunities. And if we get the development opportunities around those station stops, that would yield more ridership. So we've kind of thought through this stuff in a very detailed way to understand that the Sprinter has more opportunities for us to squeeze more potential development and transportation improvements out of.
Well, that makes sense to me. But with these double track improvements, is there potential to do local plus express?
Not with the improvements that we're talking about, because you would have to have improvements on top of those improvements to be able to bypass stations.
Okay. I'm just thinking about being in New York on the platform and, jumping.
Not
from,
New York.
Yeah, jumping from
You have to triple track certain spots.
yeah, well, even double track, you
No,
could
you have
jump. You could jump from
You have to triple
local
track.
to express at certain stops.
But
Kind of
you'd have
across
to
the
triple track.
Okay. No way. No, nothing. Okay. Never mind.
I'm happy to bring more of those string line charts to explain in detail whether it works or not. But that is part of the planning, of course, that sort of feedback, and then going back and looking at it and just coming back with an answer. This is what it would look like, and this is what you yield. And that's the same here. In the end, it's you get X minutes. Is it worthwhile the complexities or investments that are associated with that? And one last, and this is just a different type of diagram just to make this more tangible. Again, this is speed over distance. So you see on the horizontal axis, the Sprinter corridor here. So this is the actual Sprinter corridor, Oceanside on the left, Escondido on the right, and speed on the vertical axis. The blue line here is the maximum speed that is allowed in different segments of the corridor today. And you can see the absolute maximum is 50 miles in some places, but there are various places where the speed limits are considerably lower, sometimes just 20 miles per hour, and sometimes even less than that, just 15 miles per hour. When you look at how a train traverses the corridor and its speed at any given point on the corridor, then this is what current vehicles achieve, the blue line here, and you see immediately that in a lot of places they are not able to hit the 55 miles per hour maximum speed, even if it's allowed. Modern diesel multiple unit would accelerate a little bit faster, would get a little bit of time out. An electric would be even faster, but then again, it always comes down, and I'm not advocating for any new solutions here. We just do the analysis and compare the effects. It comes down to how much time can you really save. And with different vehicle technology, for example, on the Sprinter corridor, savings would be somewhere around 3 minutes. And whether or not that is worth it is either part of separate analysis or just a political judgment. With that, final conclusions, there are, of course, to be kept in mind that there are significant costs in changing technologies from diesel to electric. NCDD is evaluating a future implementation of zero emission train technology with a replacement of the Sprinter fleet that will need to occur by 2033, just due to train sets reaching their end of their life cycle. Given the lengths of the existing corridors, there currently is no significant project activity that could yield substantial travel time savings, like increasing the speeds and so forth that we have just looked at. And thus, the recommendation is to keep the focus on increasing frequency, increasing reliability, and overall customer riding experience, including making connections to other services better, and support an increase in frequency of Sprinter and Coaster. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And as everybody knows, there's been a great debate going on for the last year or so about transit and the conversation at our MPO Sandag. A lot of that conversation is centered around cars versus transit, but within the transit conversation, there have been some assertions made about new technologies and a new approach that I think are ignoring the significant investment that we have here in the North County Transit District. So I will explicitly state one of the things that I appreciate about this presentation is that it gives us all an opportunity to speak to that particular conversation and to argue that we have a pretty good system and that future investments instead of new technologies should be made in the existing system. So it's my hope that you will all take this information and use it in the conversations ahead. And if there are any other questions.
I just have, thank you very much for the presentation. Sorry to be a pain.
Not at all.
It was just the first time I saw this, I was like, oh my gosh, it was overwhelming with and I'm an engineer. So I want to understand it, but it was just difficult. So I appreciate that. And perhaps we could get a scaled down version of without as much of the engineering portion of it, possibly at Transportation Committee down at Sandag. That would be helpful as well. So Matt, you've got his information, things like that. And that would be very nice. But thank you very much. It was very enlightening.
And I'm glad you take an interest in it because you're one of the key guys that we expect to be making arguments on behalf of NCTD. So that'd be great. And I know not only are you an engineer, but you're a pilot as well. So these approach plates and such that you use to fly, I guess nowadays you just push the button and go.
Well, it's a lot easier. Nose charts. Geez.
Yes.
I'd be all over the place. Yeah.
Vice Chair Feller.
Thank you. I think what Tony was referring to is getting from Escondido to Oceanside in 7 minutes, but not everybody wants to just go, 25 miles. Sometimes they want to get off in between. So you clarified it pretty well with your statement about, it doesn't always mean you get there faster. You get where you want to go.
So just to wrap this up, because we do have an extensive discussion related to these items. The key takeaway is we're on the right track with the stuff. We can definitely do a scaled down presentation. I felt like it's really important, and we can do that you guys understand that. Yeah. But let me tell you why it's important. Because one of the things I want to make sure that we are all focused in on opinion or vision versus analysis. One of the things that we try to do as staff, and we won't always show you all of the detail that we go through to come to a point, but it's very important when you're talking about spending taxpayer dollars and developing a program of projects where you're going to ask people to make an investment, that you begin the process with analysis. And analysis helps to inform to you what's going to give you a proper cost benefit. And the reason I wanted you guys to see the string diagrams, because I know Poof, because that's why we gave him the note to say, explain it. And even once you explain it, you have to look at it a little bit to really, really understand it. It's intended so you to understand that that ORIC didn't make this up, that we're using systems and tools and applying standard terms within our business to tell you recommendations so that you don't get confused that this is my opinion or ORIC's or DB's opinion. That was the reason we wanted to make sure that this board saw the depth of it. We get it that we need to bring it down a level for other policymakers, but you guys own the railroad and are responsible for the railroad. So you're going to get the detail, and it'll help you have a better framework as you're on the board longer about how these decisions get made.
Thank you.
Can we get an analysis? And I know you've already done it on the Sprinter, but particularly at Sandag, this is very North County-ish. And if, and I know high speed has been talked about from Escondido to maybe downtown, or longer, and even maybe the coaster. I don't know if you had, if something that would be more regional, I guess, for it at Sandag would be a better, I don't know, might be a better example than most of the people that haven't even seen the Sprinter. That are down
We can
in
do
San
it. We can do it. I think the key piece, Jim, though, the honest answer is I could not understand what the region has been talking about in terms of high-speed rail, because I don't know how you do a high-speed rail on a 22-mile corridor. And again, if you apply the information that we've given you in terms of applying the standard definitions about rail and not talking about achievement of any specified speed for 15 seconds or so, the spacing for a high-speed rail station is about 75 miles and 50 is the under, okay? So I think when we simplify this presentation down, we'll be able to show you, because what they've done is using the modeling analysis to be able to produce and explain it. So when we talk about this, the other piece that's being missed is that what we're talking about at Sandag is outside of what's in the state rail plan. So the state rail plan has LA as the terminal location for high-speed rail because of the cost benefit and the impossibility of being able to do high-speed rail on, between Orange County and San Diego. So we can narrow this down to make it a little bit more targeted in terms of the information. But the truth of the matter is I can't produce a scenario for you for high speed.
Okay. Well, I appreciate it. And it's just, we've had so much lack of analysis
That's why you have this analysis.
This was, I just wasn't ready for so much. I loved it.
Jewel.
I have one last question on this one. So we're talking about both modern DMU and modern EMU, but we haven't, and the time of the travel, but we haven't talked at all about the cost of each of these and the reliability. So for us, we didn't talk about it, and I mentioned a little bit about the significant cost. So if you look at the Sprinter was built in 2006, it was about $25 million per mile, including facilities and equipment. Okay, so not cost of building, but cost of operation,
No,
and reliability of operation.
Yeah, and I'm gonna get there. I'm gonna get there.
I'm being patient.
And then you have the trolley extension, which is 11-mile extension, $2 billion. So you're talking about about $200 million a mile, right? The differences between the two is like the Sprinter versus the trolley. You have double the carrying capacity on the Sprinter trains as compared to the trolley. The operating costs are higher for the Sprinter as a cost per unit from an operating point of view because you're operating with the diesel technology. So the old diesel technology. So what we're looking at is in the future a battery powered train. And so we've started talking with vendors about what is our next procurement going to be in 2033 and developing these relationships to see what's going to be available in the market in the future. So we'll be able to give you more detail. We've already done a vehicle technology study that we presented to the board but I'm more than willing to bring that back to the board refreshed at some point in time.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, with no other questions, we will be moving on to item number 13 and receive a presentation on the long-term options for the Delmar Bluffs. And I suspect that's
Yes,
not Matt.
it's not Matt. So we have HNTB and we have Patricia McCole. She's the group director for HNTB. HNTB is an infrastructure solutions firm addressing the most complex technical, financial, and operational challenges. They offer a full range of infrastructure-related services such as planning, design, program management, and construction management. Tricia will talk about the Delmar Bluffs experience and introduce Tim with Helix. Trish is the one who's been working on these projects along with Sandag. She's uniquely qualified to provide this presentation for you all. Followed by HNTB's presentation, we're going to hear from BNSF. BNSF, as you all know, operates on the railroad. They have an easement for freight operations, significant experience as a Class 1 railroad in terms of implementing projects. So what I wanted to do was to make sure that you got a flavor for understanding the freight rail perspective about how they look at projects like this and issues like this, and balance that what Trish is going to do and outline kind of the comprehensive approach that we have to look at these as projects.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Yes, I have been the design engineer for the Delmar Bluffs for the last 12 years, along with Tim from Helix, who is here, providing the environmental consulting for the Delmar Bluffs. Our geotechnical consultant, Leighton, has been on the Bluffs since the last 20 years. So long history here of the Bluffs, and we're currently under contract to Sandag for Delmar Bluffs 4 and Delmar Bluffs 5. So I think that's why Matt asked us to give you an overview of what we're doing on Delmar Bluffs 5. We're just getting started, what we're likely to do on Delmar Bluffs 6, and an environmental overview for what the process is that we're likely to go through for both of these projects. Starting with Delmar Bluffs 5 track stabilization component, I think you're all aware that over the last 20 years, there have been a number of projects that have assessed the stability of the bluffs, prioritized areas that needed improvements. Bluffs 2 and Bluffs 3 provided soldier pile stabilizations systems to structurally support those most high priority areas. The remaining areas that are the lower priority areas are going to be stabilized as part of our Delmar Bluffs 5, including some other areas that have lost a little bit of their stability over time. We also have a number of drainage improvements that we'll be constructing and planning for the future. And I'd like to talk about service life and what that means to the bluffs. First, we're going to talk about global slope stability. And by that, I'm talking about a deep-seated stability. When we talk about a failure on the bluff, we're talking about a deep-seated failure that would actually take out the train, not the superficial movement of soil that we see at the top. When we look at that deep-seated slide, we take into account the soil type, the amount of water in the soil, and the loading conditions. And oh, there it goes. And what we do with that is we model that and we estimate what that failure slide plane is going to be. We also calculate what the factors of safety are against that happening. The areas that are the most critical are the areas where the train is very close to the top of the bluff and where there's a lot of water in the bluff. Either way, the solution is the same. We put in what we call a soldier pile or a pin. Basically, that pin is holding those two slip planes together. So whether the train is just very close to the existing top and you have extra load, or the lesser areas that we look at are going to fail when there's an earthquake. That shaking or the extra weight is able to be pinned by putting those shear pins, soldier piles into the bluffs. We have stabilized all of the areas of the bluffs that are those high priority areas where the train is very close to the top of the bluff. When we look at that soldier pile also acts as a retaining wall to support the bluff as the bluff retreats. We've designed these so that they can take up to 10 feet of bluff retreat. We estimate that as about 20 years. We have a tieback in there to add some extra support. And then what we see over time is the bluff tends to slough off as a result of bluff retreat. That is not because the terrain is too heavy. The terrain is supported by that retaining wall. So contrary to what you see on the news, the terrain is not adding the load. There is extra water in the bluff, and there are all the other forces that cause that bluff retreat that tends to make that area slough off. Over time, we add in a lagging wall between them so it supports the material behind. But it actually acts as a wall that we want to explain a little bit more about. We're going to get some help here from Imelda. When we look down right now, we don't see anything. But in just a minute, okay, can you pause that for a sec? We see. One more. So we see those soldier piles. Those soldier piles, we don't see them when we're walking out there, but they are under the ground. No pause. Pardon me? They're 10 feet apart. That's part of what I want to explain. So back up there. Yeah, start again. Okay, stop there for a sec. So that's what's kind of hard from a conceptual standpoint to really help people understand is how can these soldier piles 10 feet apart when there's space between them actually act as a retaining wall and support that bluff. That's because that little blue line in there is defining the arch. There's an arching action that works in the soil where that soil is pushing on those soldier piles to get that strength. It's very similar to what you see in an old stone arch bridge. There's compression in there that supports the back. So where you see that little blue line, that area is able to support the weight of the train. Imelda, let's go on with the rest of the visualization. We'll show you exactly what happens here. First of all, we start with our soldier pile. It's a concrete pile that goes into the ground. You see the tieback that's in. There's a steel H pile in the middle of that concrete. The area in the front can fall away, and we expect that it'll fall away. Let's go back and take a look. There are soldier piles. We really don't see those soldier piles. They're going to go away in a minute here. What you see over time is we're going to start to see that material move away from the soldier piles. Just the natural forces from wind, rain, etc. You stop that now for a sec. So what you see behind there, see how the arching occurs behind? That is actually strong enough to support that train load. That's exactly what we saw happen just after Thanksgiving with the material actually standing and supporting the train. Now, we can't leave it that way because it's going to be exposed to rain, wind, etc. So go ahead and start again. We're going to remove all of that material. We're going to clean it up. It's happy? Yeah. It's worth the wait, and I only have 17 slides. We're just 2 over. My bad, I should have had them put it into. Back one. There we go. Back one. Just Just run it through, be simpler. We'll get to the end and show you what we do. Once we have everything cleaned up, we're going to go in and we're going to add in some dowels. I think we've already fixed the whole thing now. There we go. So we're going to add in a steel cage behind. We're going to put some dowels into those existing piles, and we're going to come in and we're going to build a regular concrete wall like you would expect. Then we're going to stand back and we're going to add some rock sculpting to it. We're going to put the ballast back in on top of it. We're going to fill back in as much as we can and make it look as much as we can like the bluff. Now, in this particular case, you saw something that went down about 8 feet. That's a little bit more. Pardon me? Oh, it is, okay. So, at any rate, we do expect these types of things. We expect to see the bluff retreat. Sometimes we see a little bit more bluff retreat than we would like at one point in time. Ideally, we're going to get in and we're going to put lagging in when there's only a few feet that's missing. But drainage and the impacts that we have from urban runoff add a lot more water to our soil that give us some grief. So that brings me to our next topic of what we'll be doing as part of this project. The train was moved to the bluffs in 1912, and we still have some 1912 infrastructure left out there that's controlling our runoff. We've had a lot of development since 1912. So the increases in runoff, the concentration of runoff, the amount of subdrainage are all issues for protecting the bluff. Controlling that water and not allowing that concentrated water onto the bluffs and cause localized erosion is extremely critical to avoiding those significant failures on the bluffs. So this project includes a new complete analysis of drainage improvements. Some improvements were provided back in 2000, but we haven't done anything since 2000 to repair drainage systems and control the concentrated runoff that's coming onto the bluffs. So that will be a part of what we are going to do. We will build the most significant of the improvements in Del Mar Bluffs 5, and we'll plan for the future. Service life, the service life of Del Mar Bluffs 2 and 3. When we talk about service life, we talk about 20 years of bluff retreat. That was the time frame that we used to estimate how much retreat we would have that we're designing that soldier pile retaining wall for. That really came from an estimate of needing 20 years before we had a tunnel. Well, we're in 2020. In 2000, we thought we would have a tunnel, and we don't. So times have changed. Those soldier piles, though, they're not gone because they've been there for nearly 20 years. They're still going to act as a shear pin the way they were always designed. It's the retaining wall function of them that was designed for 20 years of bluff retreat. Now, we're going to go in and do a reevaluation of all the priority areas because obviously over the last 10 years and 20 years, things have changed. So we know we're going to complete the areas that were previously the low priority areas, but there are going to be new areas. And areas like you see here where we've had the material slough away and it's close to what that design height is, in the next number of years, those piles are going to need some additional reinforcement once they start to get past that acceptable design height. The bluff retreat trends. That is the one thing we do have going for us now, is that from 2000, 2010, 2018 to 2020, and together with work that we're getting from Scripps, we have a better history of what's happened on the bluffs. We estimate that 6 inches per year, but it's actually a very episodic thing. You see blocks fall. You don't see 2 inches at a time in general. So we're going to be able to look back and see if there's any more trends happening in certain areas that would supplement that 6 inches per year estimate. We're also going to take a look beyond this immediate project. We're going to look out 50 years and beyond for that general understanding of what might happen in the future. You know, we're very hopeful with all the publicity that the bluffs get that we're going to see more funding for a permanent solution. But from a planning perspective, we're going to look out beyond where we think we're going to be. When we're designing these interim improvements, we want these interim improvements to be a part of a future, and we want to understand if we have to go further into the future years wise, that these interim improvements can be incorporated into later phases. Oh, that was 20. The blue is 18. The green is no, excuse me. The blue is 2010. Then we're at 2018. I don't have 2020 on there yet, and I don't have 2000 on there yet. Just very simplistically, right now we offset 20 years into the future, 50 years into the future. Mhm. No, the blue, that would be, very simplistically, where would you be in 100 years? We're not going to design for 100 years, but like I said, we don't want to just be in a vacuum. We do want to understand how these soldier piles might fit into the future. Which brings me to how can we extend the service life of the systems that we've already built. When we look at the soldier piles that we built in Delmar Bluffs 2, for example, they're shorter, they're not designed for more than 20 years, and they're getting very close to some of those areas. What will happen is you see the red line. In the future, we're going to see more bluff retreat. So the solution to extending the service life of those piles is going to be to add some more lagging and add another tieback. It's not going to last forever, but it is going to increase the life of that particular facility in place. When we look at other solutions like what we're doing now, we're going to look at the simpler things. Can we make some of our piles longer rather than putting a tieback everywhere? Longer piles now are about the same price as a pile and a tieback, but it gives us a little bit more flexibility for the future. The other thing that we really want to look at is the lessons learned in the previous projects that we've done where we're adding lagging, because the lagging to the news media, like I said, looks bad. We really intend for it to be there, but we're looking to come up with some simpler solutions for adding that lagging that would be more expeditious, not designing them on a case-by-case basis. But again, just lessons learned to how to make a more efficient system out of soldier piles to support our bluffs. Why soldier piles now? Because we're still in a condition that we have a very urgent need to support the track bed. If you look at this photo, you can see some of the recent areas that have sloughed off, probably more than we anticipated with the estimated 6 inches per year. To the north, we have some soldier piles in, but the area in between is going to need some additional stabilization. The soldier pile system itself is still a very cost-effective method of stabilizing the bluffs. You don't have to add in the lagging until they become exposed. One of the big advantages of soldier piles right now for these immediate needs is that it is supported by the resource agencies. Particularly the Coastal Commission has seen this soldier pile stabilization system many times, and they are on board with us for putting in more soldier piles to do these interim improvements that are needed to keep the terrain safe. It allows the natural bluff to retreat because they're not filled in to begin with. These are all constructed within the existing railroad right-of-way. And when we put that together with measures to mitigate the urban runoff, we have a solid system for the next number of years. So that brings me to Delmar 6. What are the next steps beyond Delmar 6? Delmar Bluffs, we focused on keeping everything inside the right-of-way. Going outside of the right-of-way and looking to other solutions that would supplement what we're doing with soldier piles will be considered. The project goals are still very similar. The main goals are to maintain the train service in a safe manner, and also to buy the time that we need to plan, fund, and construct the tunnel. In this next phase of looking at improvements outside of the right-of-way, we would be looking at addressing sea level rise. 20 years ago, we weren't concerned about sea level rise. Now we're looking at moving into another time frame beyond You can see just from the erosion that's occurred at the wall down below on the beach, there's a significant amount of toe erosion. So we're expecting a much higher rate of retreat at that toe with sea level rise. So we're going to be looking at how to slow that bluff retreat down from this accelerated amount with sea level rise. We're going to be down on the beach with this type of a project. So we're going to consider how we might provide coastal access as mitigation for doing work on the beach. This is outside the right of way and it would be very significant improvements. So we're talking about a much different environmental process that Tim will talk about. But this would require an alternatives analysis. The alternatives are not defined at this point in time, but they're likely to include bluff stabilization, more piles and lagging, but going back to some of the things that we've looked at before, like toe protection. We know that that's not a really popular idea, but when you look at our soldier pile walls that are at the top of the slope right now, they're going to become exposed more over time. Now, those soldier piles don't actually rely on toe protection for their stability, but as the toe erodes, more of the bluff face is exposed. So over time, those soldier piles would have more exposure. So that balance possibly between toe protection and the soldier piles at the top is something that would be considered as this alternative. And the idea on the toe protection is that it may be easier to remove at a later date when there's a tunnel. The trench has been thrown around as an alternative. That would most likely be considered. A bridge at grade has been discussed. That would most likely be an alternative. And tunnels themselves are being considered in a different project. So all of those things are likely things that would go into a Del Mar Bluff 6, and actually deciding on those alternatives is part of the environmental process that I will have Tim talk about.
May I ask a question first? Thank you. So you had mentioned that service, back on the slide that was service life of DMB 2 and 3, that reinforcements were going to be needed because these are shorter soldier piles and they're close to the top. So in the future, what are you talking about time frame? And is this part of Del Mar 5s or 6, or is it included in the budgeted costs that we're looking at now? Work plan?
There may be some in Del Mar Bluffs 5. It's probably going to be in later stages. What we've seen so far, but we don't have all the data. So, excuse me, we're just starting the Del Mar Bluffs 5 process. What we've seen so far is less retreat than we expected. So I don't think we're going to see a need in the next 5 years, but in the next 10 years, we may. We're going to have to be looking at it more closely. Del Mar Bluffs 3 is a little bit different. Most of the stabilization there was seismic, so those soldier piles wouldn't need the additional reinforcement that we're talking about. It would be the ones that are closer to the bluff.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Tim Belsman with Helix Environmental Planning, and I'll provide you with a really brief overview of the environmental review process for Del Mar Bluffs 5 and 6. So for Del Mar Bluffs 5, we would expect and anticipate what's happened on the previous phases, which has included a NEPA categorical exclusion from FTA or FRA. No CEQA has been required because those projects have utilized the Interstate Commerce Commission Termination Act and related Surface Transportation Board rulings that preempt them from CEQA and other state and local environmental laws. They've been applied to improvements within intercity rail, interstate rail lines, which benefit either passenger or rail services and are generally within the railroad right of way, although that's not always an absolute. Like the past phases, Del Mar Bluffs 5 would require a federal coastal consistency certification from the Coastal Commission. Also, regulatory permits from the agencies where impacts would occur to federal jurisdictional areas. And it's estimated that to get environmental clearance for Del Mar Bluffs 5 would take about 12 to 18 months. So Del Mar Bluffs 6, now that's a much larger project, greater scope, greater magnitude of improvements compared to the previous phases. So we would expect the environmental process and requirements to be more complex. It would be subject to both NEPA and CEQA because we are extending outside the railroad right-of-way, and we would anticipate the environmental documents to be higher level documents than what's been required for the previous phases and what we anticipate for 5. For NEPA, it could include an environmental impact statement, EIS with either FTA or FRA as the federal lead agency, and CEQA could be an EIR with SANDAG as the CEQA lead agency. And that document, the environmental documents, whatever is determined, would address multiple build alternatives, as Tricia went through, as well as the no build alternative. And each alternative would be analyzed in detail and supported by technical studies. So it's a lot more involved, a lot more comprehensive than what's been required for the previous phases and for Del Mar Bluffs 5. Additionally, Coastal Commission approvals and regulatory permits would also be required. And the estimated time frame to get clearance for Del Mar Bluffs 6 would be about 36 months. So for NEPA and CEQA, there's about over 20 environmental resource topics that need to be considered. I've listed some of the ones up here that are pertinent to Del Mar Bluffs 6, but the point is that a comprehensive analysis will be required, and the level of detail is generally commensurate with the type of environmental document. So for Del Mar Bluffs 6, it's going to be more in-depth, more comprehensive analysis than Del Mar Bluffs 5. Del Mar Bluffs 6 will also require more.
Quick question.
Yeah, sure.
Your 36 months, is that after the 12 to 18 months? Or are you doing
No,
some of it concurrently?
that would be separate.
After, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So first you would do 5 and then 6 would be after, right? Both together?
Del Mar Bluff 6. Del Mar Bluff 6 isn't funded. So we're looking at what would be needed in the future, but Del Mar Bluff 6 isn't even funded yet. So 36 months from the time that funding is available and we could get started.
So there could be some overlap or completely concurrent if the funding was there. Thank you. So public involvement, obviously Del Mar Bluffs 6 will require more public involvement than Del Mar Bluffs 5. Scoping would be required. You have a scoping meeting, published public notices. The public would also have opportunities to provide input on some of the alternatives that would be addressed in the environmental documents. And then the draft environmental documents would be circulated for public review, which would give the public an opportunity to comment on the environmental analysis. In addition, SANDAG would also continue to implement its public outreach program. And this just shows the general environmental review process that we anticipate for Del Mar Bluff 6. Start with alternatives analysis, environmental constraints, followed by preparation of the technical studies, and then the draft environmental documents. Following public review, a preferred alternative is selected, and then you prepare the final environmental documents, and permitting comes after that. And so that just provides you with a real high-level overview of what we can expect for these two subsequent bluff stabilization projects.
A question.
Yes.
So assuming you get through project 6 and you determine, for example, a tunnel is your preferred alternative, what's the timeline that looks like to get a tunnel project developed and constructed? Which
In a perfect world, in a perfect world, if the stars are aligned and we have funding in place, and I did run it by my tunnel guys, they said less, I said more. But you know, if the community was behind the project and there was funding available, and this is a very expedited schedule to bring in probably design build contractor, it could be constructed in less than 10 years. Now, other projects have taken longer than that. So, you know, they said the stars need to align to be able to construct a tunnel project or any project quickly. Our environmental process is pretty slow. And the challenge that we've had, one of the other things that would have to happen for a real expedited process is that the funding has to be continuous. Our projects to date have kind of come in pieces where we get funding for 30%, then we get funding for 60%, and then we get funding for 100%. So, your mechanism, your construction mechanism with a design build contractor, all those things go into expediting it. But as engineers, we could do it.
I would say your engineer said 10 years. And what was your perspective?
No, he actually said 8 to 10, and I said I'm rounding to 10. And
Yeah, and I guess kind of the example that one of the questions I'm wanting our board to always ask is give the examples of places where tunnels have been identified and built within 8 to 10 years.
And that was the thing I was going to tell you is Seattle took 17.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, the reason I say that is because when we talk about it, one, the theory is a perfect that everything plays your way. Every project that I've been around, whether it was whether it was an at-grade or subway project or whatever, you typically are talking about these projects over a 30 to 40 year or longer period of time for those projects to happen. That's the important thing to know, that 10 years is a perfect world. That would mean the stars more than align in terms of us having a local sales tax that would generate a ton of money, financing, federal, state input, and an environmental and design approval process that's kind of not California-like approval.
And one other thing that I noted in the Del Mar Bluffs alternative analysis slide there, you had a bridge on grade. Could you, I assume bridge on grade would be something similar to what we're seeing in poor man's La Jolla right now along the 5, and where they're building the Midcoast Trolley Bridge that goes over that stretch. And essentially you're building a bridge similar to that's in the corridor?
I don't think that that's on grade. The idea.
No, that one's not on grade, but
Okay.
essentially you'd build the same structure in the existing location
In
on
the
grade.
existing location or offset, but you would have it at a similar elevation. So what you see out there right now is going to stay out there. Essentially, you're building piles down through the existing bluff, and that bridge structure is there to support the train. But the bluff itself can continue to erode naturally under the train, and over the next 100 years, then that bridge is going to be exposed and become a real bridge. But it would take many, many years for that bridge to become exposed.
But that is going to be part of the alternatives analysis.
That's what I can't say for certain. We're here looking at something that is going to require an alternatives analysis. So a number of alternatives have been thrown out as viable. Whether they are considered viable to take forward or not is going to take a lot more assessment.
Sharon?
Question, we have a lot of people talking about tunnels. Can you clarify where you're saying this tunnel would be?
Well, the tunnel, right now, the alternatives analysis that's going to be led by Sandag hasn't started yet. A number of years back, we did do a very high-level study for alternative locations. And basically, the alternative locations are still consistent with what's defined in the general plan, which is with the regional plan, which is between I-5 and the existing location, Camino del Mar. So somewhere between there is the likely place for a tunnel based on everything I know today.
Actually, you've done you and Bruce have done a presentation about I think it was like 4 alternatives.
5.
Or 5. And they are, one's under Camino del Mar, one's under Crest Canyon, and there's two spots for there, and one's out of the freeway. So it's a little bit further along than just conceptual. Well, it's conceptual, but it's a little bit further along.
The one thing that's different about that tunnel study, it was done actually, it started about 10, 12 years ago. Why I say it's still preliminary, and we did look at realistic alignments and some costs, but it was done for a different purpose. It was really done to look at what the entrance conditions would be to alternative alignments to make sure that we weren't doing anything with the San Diego River Bridge that would be that anything would be different. We did not want the San Diego River Bridge to preclude any of those alternative alignments. So I still expect that we will see different things coming in compared to what that study showed. It was not a complete alternatives analysis.
Vice Chair Feller.
There at one time, early, well, a lot of years ago, that we discussed a coaster stop underneath UTC. As far as, so that would be another tunnel alignment, but much different. The tunnel that lays on the bottom of the bay up in San Francisco area, you can build that faster than you can drill a tunnel.
Under the bay?
Yeah.
Under the ocean?
No.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Tucker is going to introduce the next
Yes,
speaker.
we have Curtis, not Heineken, but Heinzen. He's the manager of geotechnical. Long-term geotechnical engineering strategy in relation to submarine stabilization, rebatement support, and
Welcome.
Thank you.
And I see you have 38 slides, so.
I do, and some of them are stacked up. You're going to love it. Okay, so just jump right into it here. So I was asked to talk a little bit about how BNSF might approach a situation like the Del Mar Bluff mitigation project. One of the difficult things about talking about what BNSF would do in any specific situation without access to all of the technical data is always a difficult proposition, just because the data is always a big part of our process. So with that in mind, I thought it would be maybe helpful to take a step back and take a global approach and maybe take a look at a couple of other unique projects that we've looked at across the system, just to try to look at some common denominators between the different projects and how we approach different unique situations. And so here, what you see on this slide, this is a couple different failure type categories that different projects can fall into. I'm not going to go over all of them. Don't worry about that. But I do want to talk about a couple of specific interesting projects that fall into a couple of the categories. Whenever we're looking at a project, the things that we want to balance, we have three things that we balance. Safety, both the long and short term. We look at the impact. That's the impact on our service, on our customers, the stakeholder communities, and then on the environment as well. And then the last thing we look at, that most of this presentation is going to be concerned with, is practicality. We always look for simple solutions, practical solutions, and cost-effective solutions to our engineering challenges. So subgrade instability is kind of our bread and butter. And as we go through this presentation, I'm going to point out a couple of different things that I think might be relevant to our discussion here at the end on our observations from the Del Mar Bluffs. When we talk about subgrade stability, what we're talking about is anytime that the subgrade under the track is not performing its function due to some type of a structural weakness. A lot of times it manifests itself, just like this, where you see, is this a laser? No, it isn't. It manifests itself as a dip in the track, and it's very difficult to tell what's going on. But if you were to look underneath the subgrade, you would see something like this a lot of times. And under the train load, a lot of times you get deformation. And then these different layers, the top layer being ballast, will eat into those weaker layers below. And the one thing I want to point out is that those different layers have different permeabilities. And that's something I want you to keep in mind when we get to talking about the Del Mar erosion project. Because what happens in these layers of different permeabilities, which is just the ability of water to move through that material. Water will pond in that material. And what that does is that seeps into the surrounding soil and it causes weakness. In geotechnical terms, water is always the enemy. And then earlier in the previous presentation, there was some talk about global stability. here's what you would see in a global stability failure that we would see typical in a track. And as you see, it's rotational in nature. In this case, the inside rail is dipping. And what you see is down at the toe, you see a bulge. And so just like what was discussed, one thing that you could do is you could pin it, like what was done at the Del Mar Bluffs. Another thing that BNSF does a lot is we'll add weight to the bottom of the toe. Because if you think about this as a rotational failure with weight coming down, one way to mitigate that weight is to put weight on the other side, to push that back up. And a lot of times we find that stabilizes it and helps with erosion as well. And so if we do want to try to characterize what's going on under the subgrade, a lot of times we need to do a lot of extensive site investigation. Here you see where we've dug into a section of our track, and you can see in real time the different layers that we're talking about that can hold water. And so one of the things that we always try to do is, even if we come up with very simple solutions, we try to do very sophisticated analysis to try to determine what the best possible solution to the situation is going to be. And another way that we do that is, I won't go deep into this, but we use predictive analytic tools to try to set the scope of some of our projects. Here you can see, the output of one of those computer analysis, and it's pointing out a milepost range where it thinks there's a subgrade failure, which is highlighted here. And then here's a GPR analysis. Like I said, another thing that we can look at to, determine if something's going on. And as you can see, it's in agreement with some of our other predictive analytics tools. And the reason I wanted to go over some of that is just to point out that, careful study of the situation, even if the solution is very simple, is often one of the key components in our strategy for mitigation of any kind. Here's another project that we just went through recently. It's still fresh and painful in my mind. And so what you see here is the aftermath of a rock slide up in one of our northern Transcon corridors, single track. And that's the aftermath there with the rock setting rather precariously. And as we zoom back, you'll start to see what the physical consequences were to this particular situation, which is pretty horrifying. So obviously, when we talk about the three different balances that we use to look at different situations, safety. In this case, we want to consider the safety of the rock slide material before we have a lot of men and equipment underneath it. Also, impact. In this case, we were out of service on a very important line, and then also just as importantly, there was an impact to the environment. And so, when we went to establish. He did. Yeah, nobody was injured or killed in this event. So luckily they were able to get to the top of the locomotive, and they were saved by first responders. So just like with any situation, we want to get as much data as we can. And so I think this is a good one. I mean, we're not advocating analysis paralysis because obviously we're moving as we're collecting the data in a lot of cases. But it is important not to just wing it in these situations. You need to get all the data to make critical decisions in the best way possible. And so that's some of what we did here, looking at different alternatives to consider the practicality of the situation. We looked at bringing barges in along the river, trying to protect the environment. We did end up pumping out, the diesel oil and stuff. And one of the main things working with the DOT is that with the DEQ, we're working hand in hand with them on this project. And their main thing is they didn't want the locomotive to roll over on its side. And so in terms of cost effectiveness and practicality, sometimes those things take a back seat to the right thing to do from an impact perspective. And in this case, we decided to take a lot of time to prepare the locomotive and to pull it across. Mostly this video is just not really geotech related, but it's got to be some kind of a fishing record, right? I think I'll own the Kootenai River record for quite some time.
Was the locomotive salvaged? Were you able to?
Right.
Was
Well, it was not. Like I said, from an environmental impact perspective, taking it out that way was the way to go, but we did have to cut the locomotive up into little pieces and take it up old logging roads, because as you can see, we're on a gravel bar in the middle of a very desolate place there. But the extraction went smoothly, and having that data allowed us to pull it at an angle that minimized the impact to the riverbed as well. And so when we left there, it was exactly as it was when we, before the unfortunate incident. So here's some additional data that we took, and part of our approach was to use that data not to really overdo it. I think sometimes when you have something like this happen on a system, you kind of want to bring the hammer at it and just lay that slope back with explosives. But that wasn't the responsible thing to do. So we came up with a strategy that was more laid back. Obviously, we did have to do some blasting on there, but we did some bolting as well. And so we had this specialized rig built so that we could get up there and drill into the rock face, basically bolt some of those rocks right back onto the slope that hadn't completely detached, and then scaled what we could get for the rest of it. And then I wasn't gonna leave you guys hanging on the explosion front either. So here we are on our final explosion that we were able to get the last of the dangerous material down. So, and then switching gears a little bit to something that's probably a little bit closer in comparison to type of the scour and erosion issues that we're having at Del Mar. I don't know how many of you are heard much about some of the major flooding that impacted the central parts of the heartland of the country in 2019, but they hit BNSF particularly hard, along with many regions of several of our Midwestern states. We had a bomb cyclone that dropped a lot of precipitation onto already frozen ground. So you can see here, this was a dam along one of the river systems, and it failed. And then when this dam failed, a lot of that water came in and it hit BNSF's infrastructure directly in certain places. That was the Spencer Dam on the Niobrara River that feeds into Missouri. And so this is one of the areas where that should be a track actually, but instead it's a 60-foot deep lake. That's only about half of it. So it's about 3,000 feet there. The water, got pinned on the east side trying to get back to the river, and it blew our bridge out. So going back to the importance of data and studying, what's the best way to approach something. Even in something like this, you might have a lot of sophisticated data, but a lot of times the solution is very simple. You're not trying to win any awards with putting the railroad back in service. So this is a good view that kind of shows you some of the data that we were taking in. And you can see this was our bridge that's now buried under 43 feet of water. And then our reconstruction plan, I won't go into detail, but I did just want to show you this just to show you even trying to manage the river and the erosion and impacts that can come with that. BNSF deals with river erosion and having to deal with our infrastructure being attacked by a river a lot more than we do in oceans, because we run a lot more river systems than we do on the ocean. But they're fairly similar. And what we found is simple solutions like this. We just used rock. We moved about 500,000 tons of rock, and we rebuilt the causeway over here. And you can see this is the end result. We did look at a number of different options, including building a mile-long bridge along this stretch, but that was just deemed impractical from a cost standpoint, as well as impractical from a constructability standpoint under the circumstances in the flooding, the active flood. So this area did end up getting overtopped again because the flooding was, again and again and again in the heartland this year, and it held up really well. So here's some other images from the flood that show, you know, how erosion and scour can impact our railroad, and how it's a constant fight. And again, a lot of times, you know, the best way to respond is the simplest way, is to hold the material in place with, you know, big rocks and again, here's another example from the same flood, where this is the Platte River, another one of the tributaries to the to the Missouri River. And you can see here, this is at a particularly vulnerable location. You know, the railroads were built 100 years ago when the rivers were in one location, and they want to oxbow out and they want to go in a different location. And in this case, that location is right into our railroad right of way. So armoring against that is important. And of course, floods and other high activity, you know, scour and water events just exacerbate that. So what you do is, what we've done in the past, again, is just very simple. We take the material that was more highly erodible, that scoured away, and we replace it with material that's less erodible. It's very cost effective, it's very time effective, and it's very effective in general. Here's another example of how we've dealt with erosion. This is from the Erosion Control Initiative. This is in Washington State, and this particular project was driven by stormwater permitting in one of our facilities. But we did something slightly different here. We built a wall to retain, and what that does is, as it fails, it allows that ground to set back at an elevation that's more natural for it to have, you know, vegetation. And of course, we went back and seeded that, and so now it, you know, the vegetation helps with the erosion of the erodible material, and that we found that in certain situations that can be effective. So, what we came here to talk about, the Delmar Bluff erosion. Like I said, I haven't been deeply involved in all the you know, previous meetings, and I didn't really have access to a lot of the technical data, but I did make it out to the site and take a look. I think the first time I was out there was just after the Thanksgiving event, so it was late November, early December, sometime around there. And then I did look at some of the characteristics of the site, and so a couple of things that strike me is the geology of the site is interfingered with multiple different layers of marine, you know, conglomerate and coastal sedimentations, and they're built up in layers on top of each other. And why that is important is, if you think back to what I was just talking about earlier, where you get water trapped in layers that are of different permeability, just like with those ballast pockets in certain places like Delmar, where you can get water trapped inside the slope or under the track. That's a bad thing, whether it's caused by train loads or whether it's caused by natural conditions like this. So allowing that water to get out is always a positive thing. This is from my some pictures I took while out in the field. On the right, it appears to me that NCTD is already well aware of some of these issues. What we see on the right-hand side is a wick drain. And so what I'm assuming has happened is that we've identified areas where we think water might be ponding behind there, and you guys have gone in there and strategically placed some of these pipes to drain, and they were draining when I was out there, and it hadn't been raining. So we do know that there's water back there, and that at least at some point there's been some strategies in place to try to mitigate some of that water ponding behind the slope. On the left-hand side, this is what I saw. So I was pretty close. I said they were 11 feet on center, it looked like. 30-inch diameter concrete shafts. I was told that they don't go all the way into the sandstone layer. So you've got the inner finger layer of different deposits that I talked about, and that looks like it's about 40 to 50 feet up on the bluff. And then it looks like it's sitting on top of an older sandstone layer. And you can see the sandstone at the bottom of this slide there. And so that's a good thing. I think it gives you a couple of options depending on what you want to do. And it also provides a little bit of toe protection to the toe of your slope. But water is, you know, the ocean is acting on the base of the slope. So here's the way I see it when I'm out there. It looks to me like there's a couple different things happening, two major things that are causing the failures out here. And one, and the most significant one, is bluff erosion due to surface water runoff. Before I went out there, I had assumed that it was going to be, a problem with the toe or some type of global stability collapse that was causing most of these problems, but it's actually not. Water is running along the right of way. My guess is that it's ponding at or near the low points along the right of way, and then it's literally water falling over the edge, and it's taking sediment with it as it does so. And so if you have a big rain event, you can have a lot of sediment go pretty quickly. The top of the bluff looks like it was made up of more fine-grained particles, silty, sandy materials. The bottom looked like it was a little bit more cemented, and looks like there was maybe even some seams of sandstone and other harder material in there. And so that's one. And for the recent problems, I would say that that's the main culprit, is the surface water runoff. The second is erosion of the toe due to wave action. Talked a little bit about that in the previous presentation. It didn't look like there was a lot of that going on that it was driving the most recent event, but it does look like as the top erodes off, it gets carried off by wave action, and so it never rebuilds itself at the toe. And so it's constantly moving backwards, and it never has a chance to set up at a more stable slope that could carry vegetation or something like that. Looking around, walking up and down the bluff, it looks like it's about 1.5 miles worth if you took it just straight in a line of bluff that looks like it's having issues of some kind or the other. Here's another location that's very obviously surface water runoff. I mean, it's even rilling down the slope that you can see here. And then it looks like at the top, there's been some lagging put in place to hold at least the shoulder of the railroad. And then looking around, it looks to me like somebody at some point was aware of the issues and were taking action to mitigate. So like I said, you've got the two main culprits: surface water runoff at the top, wave action at the bottom, possibly compounded by some water that's ponding underneath the track. And so this particular slide shows me that somebody was aware of the wave action. And again, right here, this is another slide that shows me that somebody was aware of the dangers from wave action. A couple of things about this slide. You can see the two culverts, the outlet of the culverts there. What that's doing is it's taking the water from up top, I would assume, and then bringing it down in a controlled manner at a controlled place so that it can't erode the slope. And there was a couple of other, I think the old 1912 concrete letdown structure is another example of somebody knowing that what's happening. Water's ponding at the top. We need to take it down to the bottom without giving it a chance to erode the slopes. If you look at the left side of this image, I almost wonder if that is a section where there was some water that was in the embankment. And then as it eroded from the top, it caused a higher level of collapse because of that trapped water and the poor water pressure associated with that. So just at a high level, if I was having to come up with a strategy for this, or if I was going to advise my senior leadership about what I think should be done or proper questions to ask, the main things that I would want to ask is, does the mitigation strategy address the surface erosion, and does it address the toe erosion from wave action? Because anything that doesn't address those two things is not going to solve your problem long term, in my opinion. And what is the effect of the water that may or may not be trapped at certain pockets within the slope? Some useful engineering data that I would want to gather would be LIDAR or some type of a detailed topographic survey of the bluff. And what that might do for you, it would be to, water goes down, and so you take the low spots and you look where the water would tend to flow, and that's where you start your your strategy in terms of, where are we going to allow the water to collect and where are we going to safely take it down to some place where it's not going to harm us. Maybe some piezometer data or some, ground penetrating radar data to try to detect the trapped water potentially. And then detailed geotechnical analysis. I know that that's a pretty broad statement, but that could include everything from soil borings tends to be kind of the, let's get a soil boring, we'll understand the site. But that's, in my experience with railway engineering, that's typically not the case. A lot of times I get a lot more bang for buck out of actually taking a slice out of it. And what that does is it also allows it to drain if you backfill it with rock or some other type of highly porous material. In terms of potential solutions, drainage improvements, obviously on the, at the surface at track level, and then some type of a water letdown structure, where that's a pipe that runs down the length of the slope, or some type of a channel. And then toe strengthening is the simplest way to address the wave action. And that could take the form of, some type of a wall, or it could take the form is something as simple as big rocks at the toe. In fact, if I were tasked with bringing this back in service after some type of event that took it out, I would start by asking, where's the nearest quarry and how can I get rock to that toe? And I would start to build it up from the toe upwards. And then, of course, I know it's been talked about, but along bridge or a series of bridges in strategic places would be another option to consider. And those are just some things, really just shooting from the hip from my experience of working at different spots and looking at what we have out there at the bluffs. So that's really all I have. But if there's any questions or discussion.
Questions? Dave.
I have a comment.
Comment.
I actually live in Del Mar, so I've watched this. There's been a series of studies about why this is eroding. And I would really strongly suggest that you get them. Bruce Harris, who's sitting there, has them. And I think part of your conclusion is incorrect, and that the major problem there is the water that is running off under the surface. And that is the major problem. They have done borings into that, and they've seen up to 100 inches of water in the subsurface, shall we say, when that bluff was only built for about 10 inches. So that is the major problem. That's the slough off. The other thing I would strongly suggest you understand is the Del Mar formation, which is unique to the Del Mar Bluffs. There's very little Del Mar formation anywhere else in the world. And that is a unique characteristic of this bluff, which makes it more difficult than the usual types of engineering that you've been doing. And so again, Scripps Institution of Oceanography has done a whole lot of work on this. They have studied this bluff. We've studied this bluff. Sandag studied this bluff. And I would really appreciate if you would look at those studies before you come back and say, this is what you think should be done. Because those studies are extremely technically, engineeringly, and done appropriately.
So let me just comment. One, we asked BNSF to come in and give their experience, and their experience is quite significant. We didn't pay them to go through all of the detailed documents, but if you look closely at what his recommendations are, particularly the top bullets, they're totally consistent with projects 5 and 6 have been identified to perform. And so he was making a kind of a broad generality look at it. He was very careful in caveating based upon what he could understand. But I think the bottom line conclusions in terms of the type of project activities that need to be done in terms of project 5 and 6 are the same projects. And so I think it's important for us to understand as we move forward. BNSF has committed to be involved and provide technical input to us. It's important for this board to understand and for this region to understand that when we talk about solutions on the bluffs, we're going to have to talk about practical solutions. As Trish talked about before, that the original piles were put in with the expectation of 20 years and that a tunnel would be built. It's 2020 and we don't have $5 for a tunnel. And so we're going to have to focus in on practical solutions that will allow us to continue to safely operate the railroad until such time that we have unlimited money. That's kind of the focus that I want to make sure the board understands. And we are going to need railroad operators with the experience of BNSF to help us guide into decisions that we can afford until such time we have all of this money that people believe we're going to get.
Another comment on this is, yes, obviously we have to continue to make sure that the train does not fall into the ocean. Obvious, but that does not mean that we should not be immediately studying how to get the train off the bluff. It's absolutely essential that that get off the bluff. It is not going to ever be stable, no matter what we do. That, you know, if you look, you know, you can go back and look at all these photos that people have taken. You know, there's a photo there of where a spot was 50 feet wide 33 years ago when I first moved in to Del Mar at the end of my street. There's spots where it is not even a foot wide. And it's absolutely essential that we figure out how to get this off the bluff. And we can't just say, well, we're going to stabilize the bluff. We need to figure out how to get it off the bluff.
Well, and there's no part of this conversation that suggests we shouldn't be looking at the long term. And we have a Secretary of Transportation that is leading a group that's definitely focusing on making sure we address issues related to the long term as well. Any other questions or comments? Mr. Board Member Desmond.
I'm sorry, I can't help myself today. Curtis, thank you very much for the presentation. I've learned a lot, and it was a great presentation on, you know, even seeing different parts of the country and how they're managing and dealing with things. So thank you for that. And I guess, do we already have this mitigation, you know, or whatever this for the surface erosion? Don't we already have a channel or something along there that takes it out on the, I guess, just immediately?
Everything that we have, everything that we have is substandard.
So, well, we have it, but you're saying it's. Come on, Bruce is shaking his head over here.
Yeah, there's two problems. There's two problems here right now. One is they were built for the concept of maybe within 24
short
hours,
term,
half an inch of rain or something like that. Thanksgiving evening or whatever, there was probably 2 or 3 inches of rain that hit, and the drainage system failed. It's as simple as
so it didn't, okay.
And so the drainage, you know, the drainage system, there is drainage system, but again, it fails.
So it isn't adequate.
built.
So could we get so when's the presentation on these 5 options? And not that we're going to decide on them, but I guess it'd be nice to have a refresher.
Yeah, so
very vague.
so SANDAC has presented and H&TB, and as she said, those are preliminary concepts. One of the things that we're going to want to do, I think, as NCTD is to give SANDAG a little bit more guidance about considerations. And this is kind of like my high-level feedback on one of the tunnel options that goes to the 5 and then comes back to the 5. It ends up adding overall travel time on a railroad corridor. That's not an acceptable project alternative for operating passenger and freight rail. And so what I want to make sure is we engage, that our board engages a lot more to make sure that we outline some parameters for things that we look at. The other comment that I've made publicly is as we talk about tunnels, we have to talk about not only just the capital costs, but the operating and maintenance costs. And we're going to have a discussion that if people want to advance those projects, they have to identify the funding source for both up front, rather than just building a tunnel and figure it out later.
Well, and I think this board should also not necessarily take the lead, but I kind of, it's a sure when, well, SANDAG is going to do this. Well, wait a minute. Well, this board should also know what's going on, and not just waiting for some other entity to make recommendations or things like that. I think we need to have this information, and if we can take another look at the previously proposed, because we've all got it. All right, I've seen it's like veins on a running around. It's like, and which ones are feasible and which one are not, and maybe we give a recommendation or something like that. But I realize the state is involved, and which is good, but we need to be informed as well.
Yeah. So, for example, we develop design standards that guide how the railroad needs to be built. What we need to do is work together to develop some standards about the different alternatives that should be considered, but from a performance point of view, what needs to happen. And I'm in total agreement with you. We need to have more of that discussion.
Okay, thanks.
And one thing I would add about BNSF's role in this is that obviously they drive locomotives that operate on diesel, and the tunnel is going to require exhausting, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the questions that it would be interesting to get the answer to later is, do you operate in a tunnel that is approximately the same length that might be required in Del Mar? Is there anywhere else on your system that you have a tunnel of that length?
So we have tunnels of pretty significant length in different parts of the system. Jason, do you happen to know off the top of your head? I don't know if we have any of that particular length.
I don't think we have any tunnels of a mile long.
Yeah.
But I know in Northern California, we have a tunnel, I want to say several thousand feet, maybe 2,000 feet.
Yeah.
So maybe close to half a mile.
If you go back to the house and check, scour your brain, maybe if you come up with an answer on that, that'd be interesting to know, because the challenge of venting for their long locomotives is going to be significant. Board Member Edson.
Thank you. Thank you, Curtis, for the presentation. It was very thorough. And thank you for that question about venting the train, because I think that that's really important for us to know, Chair. So under potential solutions, you mentioned a wall. And I'm wondering if you have considered the environmental impacts of a wall, for example, toe erosion. Once it occurs, if we have a wall, there isn't any erosion. So then what happens with sand replenishment? We lose our beaches.
Right.
Right.
So the honest answer to the question is no. I didn't. Mostly, I was trying to give pretty vague and broad, generalized, practical considerations, and talking about walls and riprap letdowns. I mean, these are things that have been done on the site previously, and so depending on what kind of a wall you use, you can still have a certain amount of erosion, I guess, through like wooden slats or something. If you're some kind of a wall like that. But I would say that what you have is a pretty large sandstone formation there anyway. So eventually, as it erodes, you're going to get a rock formation exposed over time as it starts to move back. But it also gives you some structural leverage to key into it, even if it's just at the bottom of the slope, to try to keep some of the wave action back. But I mean, in terms of talking about the larger environmental impact, especially like climate change on coastal, I mean, I'm not really prepared to speak to any of that.
Okay.
Mostly just engineering practical solutions.
Thank you. Vice Chair Feller.
Thank you. Out here in California, especially the environmental side of it has us by the whatever. And we, we can't armor anything because of the Coastal Commission. So some of what you're suggesting we do, they want to see Dave's house in the ocean, actually, is what they want to see. I grew up on the Missouri River, played in it, and that river scours
it does
just as much as the Platte or any of those Mississippi. And it's a different atmosphere in California. So
yep, I understand that it would be a difficult permitting challenge to do anything at the toe, but if you ignore the toe, then you mostly have to relegate yourself to, like you said, the erosion will continue from the toe unless you stop it, and it's not gonna slow down. It's just going to continue to erode back until it is on the other side of the railroad. So if the railroad doesn't hold the line, then it'll be up to somebody else further back.
Thank you, Curtis. Appreciate your presentation.
I got one more thought. if I could, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Let's just, you can't have it both ways. You either want trains, you want public transportation, you want to protect the bluffs and the environment. I mean, something's got to give. So we got to make some noise and just ask people what they want until we get it. Because I mean, digging mile-long trains and, unless we're going to elevate it over I-5, which maybe is a more realistic solution in the long run. I don't know. There's no right of way to buy. There are trillions of dollars to buy the right of way and clear it. That's never going to happen. So, and I just wanted to commend you for pulling that locomotive out of that river. I thought that was pretty cool. And I think every presentation ought to have some dynamite in it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. And just before I step down here, I will say that of the things that can be done short term that I think would not be particularly against any, I don't think it's very controversial to anybody, is to improve the drainage at the top. I mean, if you look at some of those pictures, what's happening, and when it happens quickly, sure, there's drainage underneath and within the bluff itself, but when it's happening quickly, it's happening from the top. And so if you can address that, I think you'll go a long way into helping. Even if you're going to leave it the way it is, you'll give yourself a lot more time if you address the runoff from the surface.
Okay, thank you.
Do you have a LiDAR or a piezometer we can borrow?
So before we move off this item, I do want to say, in addition to Del Mar Bluffs, in a couple of months, we're going to come and present a little bit about the Miramar. So similar to the rock issue that they were showing, we have some issues at Miramar where they're subject to failures. We've had some of those failures. We're working on some things now to mitigate that risk. So our railroad has more surprises for you to learn and understand about. So this presentation is very, very timely in terms of providing a big picture, and we're going to hone it in on not just the Del Mar Bluffs, but also the Miramar Curve, so that you can understand some of the project activities that need to take place until there's a long-term solution for that.
Okay, with that, we will move into the executive director's report.
Long report. On nobody's side.
We just
Okay.
appreciated you giving us it in writing so we could read it later at
Yes.
our full leisure.
Yeah. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of things just real quick. The 25th anniversary, we have an event next week. It would be really, really great if we could have participation of all of our board members at this event. We are really trying to make this year a critical year to lead us to stronger ridership and revenue in terms of not only just the coaster, but the entire system. I will mention on the next page, this trip that we took to Siemens to look at our new locomotives that are under construction, a very beautiful picture. Board Member Krantz and Board Member Jenkins attended this trip with us. We would, and Board Member Edson, I'm sorry, attended this with us. Very, very good stuff. I will tell you the good news is the first train is supposed to be moved out right after the 4th of July. So early July, we should receive the first train. Probably by August, September timeframe, we will have received all 5 of our brand new locomotives. So really, really good stuff. So those are the 2 things I want to highlight. Thank you. If you have any questions for me, let me know.
Okay, and I would like to report that I had the pleasure of traveling by party bus to Los Angeles to the California African American Museum for a presentation by COMTO, which is the Conference of Minority Transit Officials, to see our executive director, Mr. Tucker, be awarded some recognition for his service to the industry. And it was really a joy. And I learned in the presentation that he is a political science. He's got a degree in political science, so I will be paying more attention to the advice that he gives me in the future. And then he went on to give a great speech. And in that speech, he talked about grace. And as the son of a Baptist minister, he very effectively left out the fire and brimstone part, but otherwise it was quite a speech. So I was quite proud. Board Member Jenkins traveled. The party bus we were on was a little different than the ones that I'm normally traveling in because I couldn't find the cooler. But other than that, it was a great evening, and several employees attended as well. I believe they did that voluntarily, but I don't know for sure. So I really want to say again, thanks for all that you've contributed to transit in your career and especially here at NCTD. Are there any other board member comments or questions or issues? Well, hearing none, I will adjourn this longest meeting that I've ever been in. Sorry about that.
No, appreciate that.
Yeah, well, have you gotten any of the